Before we begin tonight, I want to ask you something. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please take just a moment to hit that subscribe button right now. What you are about to hear happened to me. These are not fantasies or exaggerations. They are confessions from someone who has seen things in the dark that most people will never have to face. If stories like this keep you awake or help you find rest, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let us begin. Listen carefully to what I am about to share with you. My name is Michael Williams. I am 55 years old now, but when these events unfolded, I was 45. What I witnessed in the remote corners of Denali National Park and Preserve will haunt me until my final breath leaves my body. I have spent years deliberating whether to tell this story, fearing that nobody would believe me. But the weight of silence has become heavier than the risk of judgment. It started on a summer evening when 5 of us gathered to embark on what we believed would be an unforgettable adventure. Jessica Garcia, my wife of 15 years, had organized everything meticulously. She is practical, organized, extremely intelligent. Her attention to detail has always been one of her greatest strengths. Robert Wilson, our closest friend and outdoor enthusiast, brought his expertise with wilderness survival. He had spent his entire adult life studying the terrain, the animals, the climate patterns of Alaska. Amanda Clark, another friend who worked as a park ranger, assured us that late July was the perfect time to explore the deeper regions where few tourists ventured. William Rodriguez, who was then in his early 60s, joined us with his nephew Ashley Martinez, a younger man in his late 40s who was eager to photograph the Alaskan landscape. We arrived at Denali on a Wednesday afternoon. The mountain itself rose against a pale blue sky, its snow-covered peaks creating an almost unreal landscape that seemed to defy natural law. We spent our first night in a lodge at the park entrance, going over maps and discussing our route. Amanda had suggested an 8-day expedition into the backcountry, far from the main trails where the grizzly bears and wolves roamed freely. What makes this journey different from standard wilderness treks is that we plan to hike deep into unexplored territory, not truly unexplored by indigenous peoples, but unexplored by modern tourists. This distinction would prove crucial to understanding what followed. The first 2 days passed without incident. We hiked through valleys of dense vegetation, crossed streams that ran cold with glacial water, and navigated terrain that seemed to grow more isolated with each passing mile. The silence of the wilderness is something that cannot be adequately described. It is not merely the absence of human noise, but rather a presence of its own, a listening quality, an awareness that you are not alone in the empty spaces. On the 3rd day, as we set up camp near a narrow canyon, Amanda mentioned something that would later seem prophetic. She was examining the ground around our chosen campsite when she said quietly, "Someone has been here recently. Look at these markings on the stones." Robert came over to inspect them. "Animal?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No," Amanda said with certainty. "This is deliberate. Someone arranged these stones in a pattern. See how they form an arrow pointing north?" Jessica looked up from where she was assembling our tent. "How recent?" she asked. "Within the week, I would guess," Amanda replied. She seemed troubled by this discovery, though she did not share her full thoughts with us at that moment. That night, the temperature dropped significantly. Our thermometer read 42 degrees Fahrenheit as we settled into our sleeping bags. The sun did not fully set at this latitude in late July, but instead hovered on the horizon, creating a perpetual twilight that made sleep difficult. I remember lying awake, listening to the sounds of the night, wind through pine trees, distant animal calls, the crackling of our carefully managed campfire. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my body go rigid with primal fear. It was a howl, not the howl of a wolf, which I had heard recordings of many times. This was different. It carried an almost human quality, a modulation and complexity that no animal's vocal cords should produce. It rose and fell like a human voice, yet was fundamentally wrong in every way. The sound came from roughly a mile north of our camp, from the direction that those stone markers had pointed. I rose from my sleeping bag and moved to the entrance of our tent. Jessica woke and asked where I was going. I told her I thought I heard something unusual. She suggested it was likely a wolf or coyote, sounds that carry strangely across wilderness terrain. I did not argue, but I knew that what I had heard was not entirely consistent with any animal in North America. The camp was quiet except for the wind. The others seemed to sleep through the sound, or perhaps they were awake and simply remained silent. I could not determine which possibility unsettled me more. By dawn, I had convinced myself that Amanda's explanation of stress and exhaustion affecting my perception was the most rational conclusion. The human mind, when placed in unfamiliar environments under physical strain, is prone to misinterpretation. This is what I told myself. We broke camp after a quick meal of dried food and coffee. The day's planned route would take us further north, deeper into the park's remote zones. As we packed our equipment, I noticed Robert and Amanda speaking quietly, their backs turned to the rest of us. They kept glancing in the direction from which that sound had originated. The morning hike proceeded without remarkable incidents. We climbed through forests of black spruce and aspen, crossed open tundra meadows where wildflowers bloomed in defiant colors against the pale landscape. The views were stunning. Under normal circumstances, this journey would have been the experience of a lifetime, but nothing felt normal anymore. Around midday, we stopped to rest near a river. The water ran swift and clear, and we refilled our water containers. William and Ashley began discussing the photography opportunities, pointing out light formations and landscape compositions that would photograph well. Their enthusiasm seemed forced to me, as though they were trying to reassure themselves that everything was proceeding as planned. It was Jessica who first noticed the tracks in the soft earth beside the river. She called me over, her voice carefully controlled. "Michael, look at this." The prints were large, very large. At first glance, they appeared to be bear tracks, but the pattern was wrong. Bears walk in a certain way, their foot placement following specific patterns. These tracks were erratic, as though whatever had made them was moving on 2 legs, then 4, then 2 again, in a progression that suggested confusion or deliberate variation. Robert knelt beside the tracks, studying them with intense focus. "These are fresh," he said finally. "From last night, maybe this morning." "Could it be a grizzly?" Ashley asked, though his trembling voice indicated he did not believe this. "No," Robert said with absolute certainty. "A grizzly's tracks are distinctive. These are something else." Amanda stood apart from us, staring northward across the landscape. When she spoke, her words were barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. We need to leave this area immediately." "Why?" Jessica asked. "What's wrong?" Amanda turned to face us, and for the first time since we had known her, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "I was not going to tell you this, but I think you need to know. 5 years ago, a research team went missing in this exact region. They were studying wildlife migration patterns. When the rescue operation finally found them, there was no sign of the team members themselves, only their equipment scattered across an area covering roughly 2 miles. The investigation concluded that they were likely attacked by wolves, but no bodies were ever recovered." "Why would you bring us here if you knew about this?" Jessica's voice rose with anger and alarm. "Because I did not think the likelihood of encountering whatever happened to them was significant," Amanda said. "Missing expeditions are not uncommon in remote wilderness. The park is enormous. The odds of replicating a tragedy from 5 years ago in the same vicinity seemed infinitesimal." "What about the stone markers we found?" Robert demanded. "What about the tracks we just discovered?" Amanda did not answer. She simply began packing her gear with rigid, practiced movements. We broke camp immediately, though it was only midday. The planned route of our expedition shifted. We decided to head east, moving away from the northern territories where Amanda had warned us something dangerous existed. That was our first mistake. We were moving away from the danger, yes, but we were also moving away from the main trails that connected to civilization. In the wilderness, running from a threat often means running deeper into isolation. The hike that afternoon was tense and quiet. Nobody spoke much. We moved efficiently, determined to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. But the landscape seemed to resist our progress. Valleys that appeared on our map to be navigable turned out to be dense with undergrowth and rocky outcrops. We had to divert from our intended route multiple times. By 5 o'clock, as the sun began its slow descent toward the northern horizon, we realized we had gone much farther east than intended. Amanda consulted her GPS device and her maps, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "We have gone off our planned route significantly," she said finally. "We are now in unmapped territory. By that I mean unmapped in terms of the specific hiking paths we intended to follow." "How far off course?" Robert asked. "Roughly 3 miles, perhaps more," Amanda replied. Jessica gripped my hand. Her palm was cold and damp with sweat despite the cool air temperature. William spoke up, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to leadership. "We need to establish camp before dusk. We cannot navigate safely in this terrain in the dark. We will reassess our position and our route in the morning when we have better visibility." This was logical. We all agreed, though nobody voiced the underlying concern that was now quite apparent to all of us. We had ventured into terrain that was genuinely remote, away from the established paths that rescue teams would logically search first. The campsite we found was in a rocky depression surrounded by dense trees. It offered some protection from wind and made us feel less exposed, though I later wondered if that was true or simply psychological comfort we granted ourselves. As night descended, something changed in the atmosphere around us. The air became heavier, or at least it felt that way. The sounds of the wilderness seemed to diminish rather than increase as darkness fell. Typically, the night brings out sounds of nocturnal animals: owls calling, small creatures moving through underbrush, wind through trees. But that night, the silence was almost complete. We did not risk a campfire. Amanda suggested we conserve our fuel and rely on body heat in our tents. We ate cold food and discussed strategy in hushed tones. Around 2 in the morning, I was startled awake by a sound close to our camp. It was not the distant howl of the previous night. This was near, very near. It was a scratching sound, methodical and deliberate, as though something was investigating our tent exterior. I remained absolutely still, barely breathing. Beside me, Jessica had also awakened. I could feel her trembling. The scratching continued, moving along the length of our tent. It was too deliberate to be a curious animal. Bears do not scratch in this manner. Wolves do not investigate campsites by dragging claws along tent fabric. This was something else entirely. Something that was examining us, probing the barrier that separated us from the night. The scratching stopped after what might have been 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity. In the subsequent silence, I heard breathing outside our tent, heavy and deliberate, as though whatever was out there was standing just beyond the thin layer of material that protected us. Jessica's hand found mine and gripped it with force that nearly caused pain. Then the breathing ceased. We heard movement, the sound of something moving through the camp toward the other tents. I heard a sound from Robert and Amanda's tent, a shout cut off abruptly. Then Ashley's tent erupted with his screams. I unzipped our tent frantically, grabbing the flashlight I kept beside my sleeping bag. The beam of light illuminated a scene that my mind struggled to process. Standing between the tents was a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a man, tall and muscular, moving with an unsettling gait that seemed to shift between human and animal locomotion. But the face was wrong in every conceivable way. The features seemed to flow and shift in the flashlight beam, as though multiple faces were overlapping and separating. The mouth was open, impossibly wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp. Ashley was backing away from this thing, his screams now coherent words, prayers and pleas for help that tore at the night air. Robert emerged from his tent with his rifle, a weapon he had brought for protection against bears. He aimed at the figure and fired. The sound of the gunshot cracked across the landscape like thunder. The figure moved with speed that defied logic. It was simply no longer where it had been. One moment it stood in the center of our camp, the next it was simply gone. The darkness seemed to rush back in, as though the figure had been a focal point of reality, and its absence created a void. Robert kept the rifle raised, swinging it in arcs, trying to track something he could no longer see. "Get back inside the tents," he commanded. Now, we did not need to be told twice. Jessica and I retreated into our tent, zipping it closed with shaking hands. Around us, I could hear the others moving, calling out to confirm that everyone was alive. "Did anyone see what that was?" William's voice came from another tent, trying to maintain composure but not quite succeeding. "No," Robert said firmly. "I did not see it clearly. It moved too fast." "Is Ashley all right?" Amanda called out. "I am here," Ashley responded, his voice still trembling with adrenaline. "It did not touch me. I do not know why. It came toward me and then it was just gone." We remained awake for the rest of the night, clustered as close to each other as we could manage, while still maintaining the pretense that we were ready to defend ourselves. Robert kept his rifle loaded and close. Nobody slept. Nobody spoke much. We simply waited for dawn, watching the tent walls gradually brighten as the sun approached the horizon. When the light was sufficient to see clearly, we examined the campsite. We found nothing that could explain what we had encountered. No tracks, no signs of disturbance beyond the obvious panic visible in how we had positioned our equipment. It was as though nothing had happened, except for the fact that it absolutely had. Amanda was pale, her normal composure shattered. She kept repeating one phrase over and over. "This is not possible. This is not possible. We need to abandon the expedition," Jessica said, stating what all of us were thinking. "We need to get out of this wilderness." "Agreed," William said. "We will begin hiking toward the park entrance immediately. We will navigate toward the main trail system. From there, we can reach the lodge. It will take us 2 days, perhaps 3 if the terrain is difficult," Robert calculated. "We will have to maintain a fast pace." "Then we had better begin," Amanda said. She was already organizing her gear. We broke camp quickly and began moving south and east, the direction we believed would lead us back to more traveled terrain. Everyone moved quickly, driven by the urgent need to escape the remote wilderness where we had encountered something that violated every understanding of what should exist in this world. But the wilderness has its own logic, and that logic does not always cooperate with human intentions. The morning hike was exhausting and disorienting. We moved quickly, perhaps too quickly for the rough terrain. Ashley twisted his ankle while crossing a rocky slope, and we had to pause to wrap it with medical tape from our first aid kit. The injury was not severe, but it slowed our pace considerably. As we walked, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The sensation of being watched had become almost unbearable. It was not paranoia, or at least I did not think it was. It was something more primal and urgent. Every instinct in my body was screaming that we were not alone in this wilderness, that something was tracking us. Around midday, we reached a ridge that provided an expansive view of the landscape we had traversed. We stopped to rest briefly and consult Amanda's maps. From this vantage point, we could see for miles in every direction. Distant mountains, valleys, forests, and tundra stretched out before us in a tapestry of geological time. It was William who spotted them first. He pointed northward, back toward the direction we had come from, toward the camp we had abandoned. "There," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do you see that?" We all looked. Initially, I saw nothing unusual. Then my eyes focused on movement in the distant forest, figures, humanoid shapes moving through the trees, not running but walking with purpose and determination. "How many?" Robert asked, squinting against the bright sun. "At least 3, William said. "Possibly more." Jessica gripped my arm. "What are they doing?" "Following us," Amanda said with absolute certainty. "They are tracking our route." "But they are human, yes?" Ashley asked, a note of hope in his voice. "Other hikers who saw our campsite?" Nobody answered him because we all knew the truth. Whatever those figures were, they were not simply other hikers who happened to be traversing the same region. Their movement pattern was too coordinated, too purposeful. They were hunting us with calculation. "We need to move faster," Robert said. "We cannot rest any longer. We need to reach the main trail system before darkness." We resumed our hike, moving with increasing urgency. The landscape became more challenging as we descended from higher elevations. We had to navigate through dense vegetation, across streams that cut through the terrain, around rock formations that seemed to multiply the farther we traveled. The figures in the distance never disappeared from view. When we looked back, we could always see them, matching our pace, maintaining their distance. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we noticed something that made everyone stop in their tracks. The landscape we were traveling through had become familiar. We recognized specific rock formations, distinctive trees, patterns we had seen before. We were moving in a circle. Amanda consulted her GPS device with increasing desperation. "This is not possible," she said, echoing her words from the morning. "According to this, we have been traveling southeast the entire day. We should be miles closer to the main trail." "Let me see," Robert said, taking the device from her. He examined it carefully, then looked at the landscape around us. His face went pale. "The GPS is correct. We have traveled the correct direction. But somehow we have ended up exactly where we should not be. We are where we should be, but we are also exactly where we started this morning, roughly." This statement was so absurd that nobody immediately responded. It was William who finally broke the silence. "That is impossible," he said. "Terrain does not function that way. You either travel forward or you do not." "And yet," Amanda said quietly, "we are here. Look. That is the exact ridge we stood on this morning to survey the landscape." She was right. We had been traveling all day, moving quickly, covering miles of difficult terrain. And yet the sun position and the surrounding landscape indicated we were essentially back where we had started. Jessica was the first to voice the thought that all of us were thinking but afraid to speak aloud. "It does not want us to leave." "Do not," Robert said sharply. "Do not even suggest that possibility. There is a logical explanation. We have simply misread our maps. We have navigated incorrectly. These things happen in wilderness situations." "Is that logical?" Ashley asked, gesturing at the distant figures that were still visible in the northern distance, still matching our position with coordinated precision. That we would somehow navigate in a circle despite our best efforts to follow a set direction? That those things are still following us with absolute accuracy? Nobody could argue with his logic. Darkness was approaching. We had perhaps 2 hours of functional daylight remaining. The realization hit us simultaneously. We could not reach the main trail before nightfall. We were going to have to establish another camp, and those things were still out there, still tracking us, still maintaining their position at a distance that suggested they wanted us to remain aware of their presence. "We need to choose high ground," Robert said, taking charge of the situation. "We need to select a location that we can defend, where we can see threats approaching from multiple directions." We hiked toward a nearby ridge, one that provided views of the landscape and offered natural barriers. As we established camp for the second time, the tension among us was palpable and suffocating. "I will take the first watch," Robert said, positioning himself with his rifle at the highest point of our camp. "The rest of you should rest." None of us could rest. We sat in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, trying to process what was happening to us. It was Jessica who asked the question that nobody wanted to hear, but that all of us needed addressed. "What if we do not make it out of here?" "We will," William said with an authority that nobody believed, least of all himself. "But what if we do not?" Jessica pressed. "What if those things keep us here? What if this is what happened to the research team that Amanda mentioned?" The implications of this question hung over us like a storm cloud. Around 11 o'clock, as the sky above us showed its first hint of true darkness, the sounds began. Howls that started as animal calls and shifted into something that contained human modulation. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the illusion that the figures surrounding us in the darkness were far more numerous than the handful we had observed from the ridge. Robert fired shots in the direction of the nearest sound. The gunshots cracked across the landscape, echoing off distant mountains. We heard nothing that indicated he had hit anything. "Do not waste ammunition," William commanded. "We do not know how many of those things there are or how long we might need to defend ourselves." The sounds continued throughout the night. They came close, then retreated. They circled our camp, their approach vectors suggesting they were testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses in our position. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a new sound. It came from the northwestern direction, far from our camp but audible in the silence of the night. It was a scream, a human scream, though it carried the same unsettling qualities of the sounds we had been hearing all night. It was a voice distorted and twisted into something fundamentally inhuman. The scream continued for perhaps 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly. "What was that?" Ashley whispered. Nobody answered. We did not want to discuss what we had heard or what it might signify. As dawn approached, the sounds finally ceased. The landscape fell into the strange silence that we had experienced the previous night. It was as though the things that had surrounded us had simply vanished with the approach of light. We did not wait for a full day to break. As soon as we could see enough to navigate, we began packing our gear. We were all functioning on minimal sleep and maximum adrenaline. The fear and desperation that motivated us overrode physical fatigue and exhaustion. Our plan for the second day was simple and direct. We would travel in a straight line, using compass bearings, toward the main trail system. We would not be distracted or diverted by terrain challenges. We would simply move forward relentlessly until we reached civilization or until we could no longer continue. For the first few hours, this plan actually seemed to be working. The landscape gradually changed as we descended from higher elevations. The dense forests began to thin slightly. We started seeing signs of previous human presence, mostly old hiking trails partially overgrown and weathered. Around midday, we encountered something unexpected. A cabin, a small structure made of wood and weathered by years of Alaskan winters. It was not marked on any of our maps, and Amanda said she had no record of any cabin in this area. Robert approached cautiously, rifle raised. Through the small window, we could see inside. The interior was dark and seemed empty. The door was locked from the outside, secured with a padlock that showed no signs of recent use. "Someone lives here," William said, examining the exterior. "This cabin is maintained. The wood is treated regularly. Someone is using this, or someone was using this," Amanda said quietly. "Possibly the research team before they went missing." The thought that this cabin might have been a base camp for the disappeared research team made us all acutely uncomfortable. If they had been using this cabin and they had still vanished, what did that suggest about the forces at work in this wilderness? We did not attempt to enter the cabin. Instead, we noted its location and pressed onward, moving with increased urgency. That afternoon, the pursuing figures reappeared. This time, they did not maintain a distant position. This time, they were closer, visible enough that we could see details about them that we had not been able to observe before. They moved on two legs most of the time, but their gait was profoundly wrong. The joints bent at angles that suggested skeletal structures not perfectly aligned with human anatomy. Their proportions seemed to shift as we observed them, arms sometimes appearing unusually long, sometimes appearing shortened. The faces were indistinct in the afternoon light, but the posture and movement pattern made clear that these were not human beings. There were 4 of them now, visible against the landscape behind us. "Run," Robert commanded. "Now, toward that ravine. We can gain elevation and create a defensive position." We ran. Ashley's injured ankle made his movement awkward and pained, but fear is an excellent motivator for motion. We scrambled toward the ravine that Robert had indicated, a natural depression in the landscape that offered banks we could climb and obstacles that our pursuers would have to navigate. We made it to the ravine and climbed down its steep sides, half sliding, half falling toward the bottom. The crash of our passage through vegetation and the sound of our desperate gasps for air were the only sounds for several seconds. Then we heard them pursuing us. They did not attempt to climb down slowly or carefully. They simply descended with speed that defied gravity and bone structure, moving in ways that bodies should not move. Robert positioned himself at the top of the ravine and fired. Again and again he fired his rifle at the descending figures. The sounds of his gunshots were almost deafening in the confined space of the ravine. We heard what might have been screams from our pursuers, but they were not quite screams. The sounds they made when hit were inhuman and distorted, more like the sounds of wounded animals than wounded humans. But they kept coming. Robert ran out of ammunition. He had brought only a limited supply, assuming that normal wildlife defense would be sufficient for our wilderness expedition. The creatures descended into the ravine despite the bullets that should have stopped them. William grabbed a large rock and hurled it at the nearest figure. The rock connected with what might have been the creature's shoulder, and it stumbled momentarily, but only momentarily. We ran deeper into the ravine, moving along a small stream that cut through the landscape. The ravine twisted and turned, creating natural barriers and concealment. We moved quickly, Jessica and I supporting Ashley between us as he struggled with his injured ankle. Behind us, we could hear the creatures pursuing. The sounds they made were getting closer. Then the ravine opened into a wider space, and we burst out into a section of the landscape that seemed impossibly wrong for this region. The trees here were different, twisted and gnarled in ways that suggested they grew in defiance of their own nature. The light filtering through the canopy was green and sickly. "This place," Amanda said breathlessly, stopping despite the immediate danger. "This is not part of Denali. This cannot be Denali." She was right. Somehow, in our desperate flight, we had left the normal wilderness and entered something else entirely. The geography was impossible. We could see mountains in the distance that we had not observed before. The vegetation was subtly wrong, as though we were looking at a photograph of Alaska that had been slightly altered by someone who did not quite understand what authentic Alaskan wilderness should look like. The creatures emerged from the ravine behind us, and they seemed more at ease in this twisted landscape than they had been in the normal world. William pointed ahead. There, through those trees, a light was visible in the distance. Not natural sunlight, but artificial light. The light of a human structure. We ran toward it. Whatever this place was, whatever impossible geography we had fallen into, there was shelter ahead. There was refuge. The structure was another cabin, similar in design to the one we had encountered earlier, but in better condition, better maintained. This one had smoke rising from its chimney, suggesting that it was inhabited. We hammered on the door, desperate, gasping, our voices hoarse from exertion and terror. The door opened slightly, and a face appeared in the gap. An old face, weathered and scarred, belonging to a man whose eyes held depths of experience and trauma that we could not begin to fathom. "Come inside," he said simply, quickly. We did not hesitate. We practically fell through the door as he pulled it open wider. Behind us, we heard the creatures approaching, their disturbing howls cutting through the twisted forest. The door slammed shut. The old man threw multiple locks and deadbolts into place. Through the window, we could see the creatures stop at the edge of the clearing around the cabin. They did not attempt to enter. Instead, they simply stood there, watching, waiting, their presence filling the landscape with a palpable malevolence. The old man who had sheltered us was named Thomas Blackwood. He was 73 years old, though his face suggested he might be much older, as though the years he had spent in this place had aged him beyond simple chronological measurement. His cabin was surprisingly well maintained and appointed. Books lined the shelves. A wood stove provided warmth. The kitchen contained supplies that indicated he had been living here for a considerable amount of time. But the atmosphere of the place was oppressive, filled with the weight of something that could not be adequately named. Thomas offered us water and food, which we accepted gratefully. We were all in various states of shock and exhaustion. It took several minutes before anyone could formulate questions coherent enough to ask this stranger who had appeared when we desperately needed intervention. It was Robert who finally spoke. "What is this place? How did we end up here? And what are those things outside?" Thomas sat in a weathered chair, his aged hands folding together as he considered his response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quality of someone who had been preparing this explanation for many years, but never imagined he would be forced to deliver it to anyone. "You are still in Denali," Thomas began, "but you have also moved outside of Denali. You have entered the spaces between, the places that exist in parallel to the normal world. They have always existed here. Long before Denali became a national park, long before the United States was a nation, these spaces existed in the wilderness of what you call Alaska." "That is insane," Robert said immediately. "There is no such thing as spaces between. Wilderness follows geographical and physical laws. It does not operate in fantastical ways." "Does it not?" Thomas asked with a sad smile. You have been pursued by creatures that move in ways that defy your understanding of skeletal structure and physics. You have traveled for an entire day and returned to your starting point. You have observed a landscape that exists in a location you can pinpoint on maps and yet does not appear on any maps. And yet you insist that I am the one speaking insanely? This logic was difficult to argue against. Jessica pressed forward with a more practical question. Who are you? How are you here? Why have you chosen to live in this place? Thomas stood and moved to the window, peering out at the creatures that maintained their vigil around the cabin. I am someone who made poor choices in his youth, someone who encountered forces he did not understand and was absorbed by them. I have been in this place, in these spaces between, for almost 40 years. Time moves differently here. Sometimes a day feels like a year. Sometimes a year passes like a day. It is part of the nature of this place. The creatures outside, William said. What are they? Are they the thing that took the research team? They are many things, Thomas said slowly. They are entities that exist in these twilight spaces. Some call them skinwalkers, though that term comes with baggage and misunderstanding from various indigenous traditions. The term itself is not quite accurate. They are beings that exist between states, not fully human, not fully animal, not fully anything that your contemporary understanding of biology and consciousness can accommodate. Why do they pursue us? Ashley asked, his voice trembling. What do they want from us? They want to understand you, Thomas said. They want to examine how humans function, what drives you, how you think. They capture people and observe them. Some of those people they eventually release, allowed to leave the between spaces and return to the normal world, but forever changed by the experience. Others they keep. Those become like the creatures themselves, transformed into something neither human nor fully monster. The implications of this statement made all of us physically recoil. Amanda spoke up, her ranger's logical mind struggling against the impossibilities she was confronting. This cannot be the actual explanation. There must be a rational basis for what is happening. Perhaps we have suffered some kind of environmental exposure that is causing hallucinations. Perhaps there is a gas leak in this cabin that is affecting our mental state. You are welcome to test that theory if you wish, Thomas said. There are no gases. There is no toxin. Your minds are functioning normally within the parameters of this reality. It is the reality itself that does not match your expectations of how reality should function. Robert looked at me, and I could see that he was reaching the same conclusion I was beginning to accept. We were going to have to work with what we had been told, insane as it was, because the alternative explanations were no more coherent. If we are truly in these between spaces, how do we leave? Jessica asked. How do we return to normal Denali? How do we return to civilization? That is the question that determines whether you live or whether you become like the creatures outside, Thomas said. The path out exists. It always exists. But you must understand the nature of this place before you can navigate it successfully. Thomas spent the next several hours explaining what he knew of the between spaces. According to him, they are locations where the barrier between the normal world and the realm of indigenous spirits and primal forces has worn thin. In Alaska, these spaces are numerous. They exist particularly in regions that are remote and largely untouched by human civilization. The creatures that inhabit these spaces are ancient. They predate human arrival in North America. They exist as predators and hunters, though their prey is not typically physical in nature. They feed on experience, on novelty, on the sensation of encountering consciousness that is sufficiently different from their own to be interesting. They are not evil in any moral sense, Thomas explained. They do not operate with human ethics or human considerations. They exist, and they do what their nature compels them to do. That is all. But they can be resisted, he continued. They can be avoided. If you understand the rules of this place, if you accept that the physics and geography here function differently than they do in the normal world, you can navigate through the between spaces and emerge on the other side. What are the rules? William asked, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who was grasping at any hope of survival. The most important rule is intention, Thomas said. Your mind creates the landscape around you. The environment reflects your mental state, your beliefs, your expectations. If you believe you are lost, you will become lost. If you believe the landscape is turning against you, it will turn against you. If you believe escape is impossible, it will become impossible. That is philosophy, not practical advice, Robert protested. Philosophy and survival are not always separate things, Thomas replied. In places like this, they are intimately connected. That night, as we settled into uncomfortable positions within Thomas's cabin, we could hear the creatures outside moving around the structure. They did not attempt to break down the doors or windows. They simply maintained their presence, a constant reminder of the danger that existed beyond the fragile walls that separated us from them. Thomas explained that the cabin itself was protected. He had spent decades understanding the nature of the between spaces and had learned how to mark the structure in ways that prevented the creatures from entering. The marks were not visible to casual observation, but he had carved them into the wood during moments of clarity and ritual that he did not fully explain. Morning came, though the distinction between night and day in this place was not nearly as clear as it was in the normal world. The light was perpetually the same shade of sickly green, the sun never rising or setting in any meaningful way. "I must tell you something," Thomas said over breakfast, which consisted of preserved food that he explained he had learned to cultivate in the gardens surrounding his cabin. "The creatures outside are not interested in immediate violence. They are interested in you as ongoing subjects of observation. They are hoping that you will attempt to leave the cabin so they can begin their study. If you remain here, they will eventually lose interest and move on to hunt other prey." "How long would that take?" Ashley asked. "Weeks, possibly months," Thomas said. "Time is not reliable in this place." "And then what?" Jessica asked. "We simply wait in this cabin while time passes in incomprehensible ways?" "If waiting seems preferable to you, then yes, that is an option," Thomas said. "However, if you wish to return to the normal world, if you wish to see your families again and return to your lives, there is another path." "What path?" I asked. "The creatures hunt by scent and sight, and by following the paths that your thought creates in the landscape," Thomas explained. "But there is a location, a place deep in the between spaces, where the barrier between the worlds is particularly thin. If you can reach that location, if you can pass through at that precise point, you will emerge back in normal Denali. You will be on the main trail, near the park entrance. From there, escape back to civilization is assured." "How do you know this?" William asked with clear skepticism. "Because I have seen 3 groups pass through that location," Thomas said. "I have followed them to understand how the transition works. I have not attempted it myself because I have been too afraid, and because my years in this place have changed me in ways that I do not think would allow me to successfully transition back. But I know the location. I can provide you with instructions on how to reach it." We spent the remainder of the day preparing for our departure. Thomas provided us with supplies from his storage areas, including food concentrated in ways that could sustain us for several days of travel. He also provided us with a map that he had drawn himself, marking the path through the between spaces that would lead us to the transition point. The map itself was disturbing. It showed a landscape that did not match the geography we had observed during our time in this place. The paths were marked in symbols that Thomas explained represented states of mind rather than actual physical routes. "The landscape responds to your thinking," Thomas explained repeatedly. "If you maintain clear intention and strong belief in the path forward, the terrain will shift to accommodate your journey. If you become confused or doubtful, if you allow fear to dominate your thinking, the landscape will become hostile and you will become lost." "This is not rational," Robert maintained, even as he was studying the map and memorizing its symbolic content. "Correct," Thomas agreed. "It is not rational. That is why many who attempt this journey fail. They cannot abandon rationality. They cannot accept that the rules they have built their understanding upon no longer apply. Those people become lost in the between spaces permanently." As evening approached, Thomas made a decision. "I will guide you part way," he said. "I cannot go all the way to the transition point, but I can take you to the first major waypoint. From there, the path becomes clearer, and you should be able to navigate it yourselves." "Why would you do this?" Jessica asked. You have been here 40 years. Why risk yourself for strangers? Thomas looked at her with eyes that held deep sadness. Because I have regretted every day of those 40 years that I did not attempt what you are about to attempt. I have been paralyzed by fear and by the changes that this place has wrought upon me. But perhaps I can at least save you from meeting the fate I have met. Perhaps that will mean something. We prepared to depart in the morning. As night settled over the landscape, the creatures outside became more active. They circled the cabin continuously, their cries and howls creating a symphony of sound that seemed designed to instill despair and hopelessness in anyone who heard it. But we steeled ourselves. We gathered our courage. We prepared mentally for what was to come. And we tried not to think about the fact that Thomas had said many people who attempted this journey had failed. We tried not to contemplate what failure would mean. We tried, and mostly we succeeded. We departed from Thomas's cabin at first light, if morning could be said to exist in this place. The creatures maintained their distance, watching but not yet attacking. Thomas moved ahead of us, his ancient body moving with surprising sure-footedness despite his age and the decades he had spent in this realm. The landscape shifted as we walked. This was not metaphorical. The actual terrain changed. Paths that did not exist moments before would manifest ahead of us. Trees would rearrange their positions. The topography would transform in ways that violated every understanding of geological permanence that we had ever possessed. Do not question what you are seeing, Thomas instructed, as we navigated through these shifting spaces. Do not try to rationalize the changes. Accept them as the normal state of existence in this place. Fighting against the reality of this environment only strengthens its grip upon you. We moved in silence, focused on maintaining our intention to proceed forward. Jessica walked beside me, her hand occasionally finding mine as we traversed particularly treacherous sections of terrain. Robert maintained a position at the rear of our group, rifle loaded despite Thomas's insistence that weapons were essentially useless against the creatures that inhabited this place. "It gives me something to do with my hands," Robert said when Thomas had challenged this choice. "And it gives me the psychological comfort of believing I can fight back if I am forced to do so." Thomas did not argue further. Around what we estimated to be midday, we encountered our first direct encounter with the creatures since leaving the cabin. They appeared ahead of us on the path, blocking our route forward. There were 5 of them this time, their forms more distinct than they had been in our previous observations. What struck me most forcefully about them was the degree to which they seemed to approximate human form, while remaining fundamentally alien. They had arms and legs, and a torso and a head, but the proportions were wrong. The joints moved in ways that suggested additional articulation points. The faces were almost humanoid, but with features that seemed to suggest multiple expressions overlapping each other simultaneously. "Do not run," Thomas commanded. "Do not show fear. Walk directly toward them as though they do not exist." This was perhaps the most difficult instruction we had received throughout our ordeal. Every instinct screamed at us to flee, to fight, to do anything except walk calmly toward entities that were clearly predatory and dangerous. But we did as Thomas instructed. We maintained our pace and our direction, walking directly toward the creatures. When we were perhaps 20 feet away from them, the creatures simply moved aside. They parted like a living curtain, creating a path for us to pass through. As we walked between them, I felt the weight of their observation, the sense that they were studying us at a level far deeper than simple visual perception. It was as though they were reading our thoughts, our fears, our hopes, our intentions. The sensation was deeply violation and profoundly disturbing, but we continued forward, refusing to show the reaction we felt. Once we had passed them, we did not look back. We maintained our pace and our direction, trusting that they would not pursue us, despite their clear advantage in numbers and capabilities. For hours, we walked through a landscape that seemed increasingly alien and impossible. The sky sometimes appeared overhead, sometimes seemed to exist in other directions simultaneously. The light came from no discernible source, yet everything was clearly visible. The vegetation changed from trees to flowers to geometric shapes that hurt to observe directly. The psychological toll of this journey was beginning to manifest in visible ways. Ashley was moving with increasing difficulty, his injured ankle clearly causing him severe pain. Amanda seemed to be retreating into herself, her rational mind struggling against the fundamental assault on her understanding of physical law. William maintained his composure outwardly, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands occasionally clenched into fists as he processed what he was experiencing. "We are approaching the first waypoint," Thomas announced after what might have been 6 hours of walking. "You see that formation ahead? The rocks that stand upright like pillars? We did see them. A collection of boulders arranged in a pattern that could have been natural or could have been deliberately placed. They formed an archway of sorts, an opening that led into a particularly dense section of the twisted forest. This is where I must leave you," Thomas said, stopping some distance from the stone formation. "I cannot go beyond this point. I do not have the courage to do so, and my years in this place have changed me in ways that would prevent successful passage even if I attempted it." "How do we proceed from here?" William asked. "You walk through the arch," Thomas said simply. "You maintain your intention to reach the transition point. You do not become lost in the landscape, even if the landscape becomes confusing. You continue until you reach the end of the path, and then you walk through whatever barrier stands between this place and the normal world." "How will we know when we have reached the transition point?" Jessica asked. "You will know," Thomas said with certainty. "There is no way to adequately explain it until you experience it. You will know." We gathered around Thomas, and each of us spent a moment thanking him for his assistance and his sacrifice. He waved away our gratitude with a gesture of resignation. "I hope you make it," he said simply. "I hope you all survive this journey and return to your lives. More than anything, I hope that you do not end up like I did, trapped in the between spaces, growing old in a realm where time has no meaning." He turned and began walking back the way we had come. After a few steps, he paused and looked back at us one more time. "One final instruction," he called out. "If you encounter the creatures again, do not attempt to communicate with them. Do not try to reason with them. They do not understand reason in any way that you would recognize. They are curious, but their curiosity is predatory. Do not engage with them in any way." Then he was gone, disappearing into the twisted landscape like a ghost fading from observation. We turned to face the stone arch. Beyond it, the landscape appeared to shift even more dramatically than it had during the rest of our journey. The forest seemed to rotate and twist in ways that challenged perception. The colors were more vivid, more saturated, more wrong. "Together," William said, and we moved through the arch as a unified group. Immediately upon passing through the stone gateway, we experienced a sensation best described as being inverted. Our perceptions seemed to turn inside out. Up and down ceased to have meaning. Forward and backward became ambiguous directions. We were walking through a space that contained more dimensions than we were equipped to perceive, but we kept moving. The sensation gradually intensified. At points I felt as though we were walking through solid material, as though the very air around us had become dense and resistant. At other points we seemed to be falling, dropping through empty space, though our feet never left the ground beneath us. Robert maintained his grip on his rifle, though he did not fire it. He seemed to be using it as an anchor, a reminder of the physical world he was trying to return to. Ashley was moving with visible pain, but he did not slow us down. He seemed to be driven by something beyond physical capability, a desperate will to escape this nightmare realm. Amanda was silent but present, her grip on the map that Thomas had provided never loosening. She was holding on to the one concrete thing in a landscape of complete impossibility. Jessica and William exchanged glances occasionally, a silent communication that seemed to convey mutual determination to survive this ordeal. I found myself thinking about our lives before this expedition, the comfort of normalcy, the reliability of physical law, the simple pleasure of being in a place where the horizon remained stationary and the ground beneath your feet did not shift with your perceptions. The landscape around us began to shift with increasing frequency. The transformation was no longer gradual. Entire vistas would change in moments. The twisted forest we had been walking through gave way to open tundra, which transformed into canyons of impossible depth, which became meadows of flowers that glowed with bioluminescence. We did not attempt to understand these changes. We simply continued forward, trusting that forward momentum was leading us in the correct direction. How much time passed, I cannot accurately determine. In this realm, hours could pass like minutes, or minutes could extend into subjective hours. My exhaustion was becoming nearly unbearable. My muscles were screaming. My mind was beginning to fray at the edges. But we continued. Then the landscape changed in a way that suggested we were approaching something significant. The shifting and transforming slowed. The impossibilities became less frequent. The violations of physical law became more subtle and less dramatic. We emerged from a dense forest into an open area, and suddenly we could see clearly. We could see the distinctive peaks of Denali in the distance, the familiar landmarks of the park, the landscape that existed in the normal world. But we were also still in the between spaces. The landscape we were standing in existed in both places simultaneously, the barrier between the worlds made visible and tangible. The transition point, Thomas had called it. Ahead of us, the landscape seemed to shimmer, as though we were looking through heat distortion or through water. Beyond that shimmer, we could see the familiar features of normal Denali more clearly. "That is it," William said, pointing. "That is the way out." We moved toward the shimmering boundary, walking slowly now, conserving the last reserves of our strength. But as we approached, we heard the sound we had been dreading, the howls of the creatures. They were behind us, closing in, having tracked our path through the between spaces. Robert spun around and fired several shots in the direction of the sound. "Go," he commanded. "Do not wait for me. Go now." "We are not leaving you," Jessica said. "You will leave me if I tell you to," Robert said with finality. "I am decreeing that this is the moment when we separate. You will go through the transition point. You will return to the normal world. You will escape this place." The creatures emerged from the twisted forest behind us. There were 6 of them, perhaps more. They moved with coordinated precision, cutting off any route of retreat we might have considered. Robert fired again. One of the creatures staggered from the impact, but it did not fall. It did not even seem to be significantly injured. It simply continued advancing toward us. "Go," Robert commanded again, his voice absolute with authority. William grabbed Jessica and pulled her toward the shimmering boundary. Ashley moved in that direction as well. Amanda hesitated, looking between Robert and the transition point. I was the one who grabbed her and pulled her forward. "He is right," I said. "We have to go." She resisted for only a moment before allowing herself to be drawn toward safety. We reached the shimmering boundary and pressed through it. The sensation was indescribable. It was like passing through a barrier of compressed energy, like emerging from one world into another, like being born into a different reality. For a moment, we existed in both places simultaneously. We could see the twisted forest of the between spaces behind us, and the normal landscape of Denali ahead of us. We could see Robert standing at the transition point, his rifle raised, facing down the creatures with the courage of someone who had accepted his fate. Then we completed the transition. The between spaces fell away. We collapsed onto the familiar ground of the normal world, breathing air that smelled like genuine Alaskan wilderness, feeling the solid reality of material that did not shift and transform. We were out. But as I looked back at the place we had emerged from, I saw a space that looked like empty air. The shimmering boundary was no longer visible. We could not see back through to the between spaces, and Robert was gone. He had sacrificed himself to ensure our escape. He had used his final moments to give us time to cross the boundary. He was still there, in the between spaces, facing those creatures alone. We did not cry. We did not scream. We simply lay on the ground, gasping for breath, processing the fact that we had survived, while one of our group had not. It took several minutes before we were able to stand and assess our situation. We were on the main trail, exactly where Thomas had said we would be. The park lodge was roughly 8 miles away by hiking distance. We gathered ourselves and began the journey toward civilization. The hike to the lodge took us approximately 4 hours. I barely remember the journey. My mind was functioning on a level of autopilot, moving forward mechanically, while my consciousness remained partially trapped in the between spaces, still confronting what we had experienced. The other group members were similarly affected. Ashley struggled with his ankle, but adrenaline and the psychological need to put distance between ourselves and what we had escaped drove him forward. Amanda moved in silence, her ranger's mind clearly working through the implications of what she had encountered, trying to reconcile it with her understanding of the natural world. William maintained a steady pace, his leadership intact even though the mission had taken an enormous toll. Jessica moved beside me, occasionally reaching over to ensure I was still physically present and not drifting entirely into dissociation. As we approached the lodge, we were spotted by staff members who immediately recognized that we were in distress. They rushed forward to assist us, to provide us with water and food, to begin the process of extracting us from the wilderness. We were transported to the nearest medical facility by helicopter. The medical personnel who examined us were puzzled by our condition. By their assessment, we had suffered no serious injuries beyond Ashley's ankle sprain, which was consistent with what he had reported. Our dehydration could have been addressed with simple rehydration fluids. Our exhaustion was consistent with extended wilderness travel. But we were traumatized in ways that defied simple medical categorization. The park rangers questioned us extensively about our expedition. We told them the truth as we understood it, that we had become lost in the wilderness, that we had encountered hostile wildlife, that one member of our group had not returned. We did not mention the between spaces. We did not describe the creatures or the impossible landscape shifts. We knew that such an account would result in psychiatric evaluation and would not lead to any productive search effort. Robert's body was never found. The search and rescue operation found no trace of him in the area where we had reported he had remained. Officially, he was classified as deceased, presumed lost in the wilderness due to predation by bears or wolves. The case was eventually closed as a tragedy of wilderness exploration. We never spoke about the full truth of what had happened to anyone except each other. After returning to the normal world, life attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy. We all returned to our homes, our jobs, our lives, but none of us could shake the psychological residue of what we had experienced. Jessica developed insomnia. She would sit up at night, staring out the window, seemingly looking for shapes in the darkness beyond our home. She eventually sought psychological counseling, but even after years of therapy, she still struggles with the memory. Ashley eventually recovered physically, but he transferred jobs to an area that no longer involved wilderness work. He could not bear the thought of returning to remote natural environments. Amanda resigned from her position as a park ranger. The irony was not lost on any of us. The person who had been trained and prepared for wilderness emergencies was the one most fundamentally shattered by the experience. She took a position working with environmental protection organizations in an office setting, far removed from the wilderness that had betrayed her. William never spoke about the expedition except when absolutely necessary. He seemed to have compartmentalized the experience in a way that allowed him to function normally. But occasionally, I would catch him staring into the distance with an expression that suggested his consciousness was elsewhere. For myself, I have spent years trying to process what happened. I have pursued knowledge about indigenous traditions regarding the between spaces, about the nature of spiritual realms that exist parallel to our own. I have read accounts from other people who have described similar encounters in remote wilderness areas across the world. What I have come to understand is this: the between spaces are real. They exist. They are inhabited by forces that we do not fully understand, that our modern worldview is completely unprepared to encounter. They are not evil, but they are indifferent to human welfare in ways that make them effectively dangerous. Robert knew the risks when he remained behind. He made his choice consciously, and I believe he made it willingly, understanding that his sacrifice was the only way to ensure that the rest of us could escape. I do not know what happened to him after we crossed the boundary. I try not to think about it. But sometimes, in dreams and during moments of deep introspection, I wonder if he is still there, in the between spaces, being studied and observed by creatures that regard consciousness as something fascinating and extractable. As for Thomas Blackwood, the old man who guided us to the transition point, I have spent considerable effort trying to determine if he was a real person, or if he was some kind of manifestation of the between spaces themselves. I have researched property records for cabins in Denali. I have found references to someone named Thomas Blackwood in archival documents from 40 years ago, a man who went missing while conducting research in the park. The evidence suggests he was real. The evidence also suggests that he has been trapped in the between spaces for longer than either of us has been alive. In my darkest moments, I wonder if Thomas even truly left us at the first waypoint. I wonder if he was still with us in some form as we navigated the path between worlds. I wonder if his presence, his knowledge, his sacrifice was what allowed us to succeed in crossing the boundary. I will never know for certain. What I do know is this. I survived something that should have killed me. I escaped a realm that exists outside the normal rules of physical reality. I returned to the world I came from, fundamentally changed by the experience. And I carry with me always the knowledge that just beyond the edge of our normal perception, the between spaces exist. They are waiting, they are watching, and they are infinitely patient. If you are listening to this account, and you are considering wilderness expeditions into remote areas of Alaska or similar regions, I offer this warning. Be aware that the wilderness is not merely what appears on maps and in guidebooks. There are spaces that exist between civilization and untamed nature where the normal rules do not apply. Be careful in those places. Pay attention to signs that things are wrong, unusual animal tracks, repeating landmarks when you should be making progress, sounds that do not quite match any known creature. If you encounter such signs, leave immediately. Do not investigate. Do not remain. And if you find yourself trapped in a realm that defies explanation, if you find yourself unable to navigate terrain that should be straightforward, if you find yourself being pursued by entities that move wrongly and sound wrongly, then put your faith in intention and will, because those might be the only things that can save you. My name is Michael Williams, and I have lived with the consequences of my encounter with the between spaces for 10 years now. I tell this story not because I expect you to believe it, but because I need to bear witness to what occurred. I need to acknowledge that Robert Wilson gave his life to save the rest of us, and I need to warn others of the danger that exists in remote wilderness, the danger that Thomas Blackwood warned us of, the danger that still exists today in the untamed corners of Denali National Park and beyond. Listen carefully to this account, and if you are planning wilderness expeditions, be mindful of what I have shared. Not all places are safe. Not all dangers can be explained by conventional means. Some threats exist in the spaces between, and they are very, very real. The plane descended through clouds that seemed to cling to the fuselage like something alive. I watched the tundra unfold beneath us, vast, treeless, and profoundly empty. Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost city in the United States, they called it. 4,100 souls clinging to existence at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. I had been hired to guide a group of summer adventurers through the surrounding wilderness, a contract that promised good money, and the kind of solitude I had come to crave after years of leading predictable expeditions through crowded national parks. The group assembled at the small terminal. 5 clients and myself. I already knew their names from the booking forms, but meeting them in person was different. There was always a moment when guides truly saw their charges for the first time, and this moment carried weight. Natalie Ramirez stood near the window, dark hair pulled back severely, her eyes carrying the intensity of someone accustomed to control. 35 years old, according to her profile, but something in her bearing suggested she had been sharp-edged her entire life. She wore expensive outdoor gear that had clearly never seen serious use. Beside her, Charles Sanders, 57, broad-shouldered and quiet. His registration mentioned he had hunted extensively, though I noted his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his pack. Douglas James arrived late, which somehow seemed inevitable. 54 and aggressively cheerful, he wore a camera around his neck and spoke too loudly about all the photographs he intended to capture. Carol Watson, his wife, followed behind with the exhausted expression of someone perpetually apologizing for someone else's existence. 50 years old, She had requested dietary accommodations 3 times in her preliminary emails. Benjamin Brooks, the youngest at 42, possessed the nervous energy of someone escaping something. He barely made eye contact during introductions. And then there was Judith Kelly, the eldest at 68, who seemed entirely unconcerned by the Arctic landscape spreading out before us. She simply nodded when I introduced myself and asked about the weather forecast with the tone of someone inquiring about traffic conditions. "The wind picks up this time of year," I told her. "We should make our first camp by evening." "How far?" she asked. 30 kilometers. The terrain is relatively open until we reach the ridge line. After that, we'll be among the hills." "Good," she said, and offered no further comment. I had learned not to read too much into client personalities during initial meetings. People transformed in the wilderness. The aggressive ones often became vulnerable. The quiet ones sometimes erupted into unexpected gaiety. The tundra had a way of revealing what civilization normally concealed. We loaded our supplies into the 2 all-terrain vehicles that would take us to the starting point of our expedition. The late afternoon sun hung at an angle that seemed wrong, casting shadows that fell in directions my body did not expect. Even in June, even with the seasons tilted toward eternal daylight, Barrow occupied a threshold between normal geography and something else entirely. The drive took 2 hours. The landscape revealed itself in stages. First, the signs of habitation, the airport, the cluster of buildings that constituted downtown Barrow, the small cemetery where I noted markers bearing dates that made the brevity of lives up here somehow more apparent. Then the transition into true wilderness. The tundra stretched in all directions, undulating gently, broken only by small lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors placed by some careless giant. I had guided groups here 4 times before. Each expedition carried a similar rhythm: initial nervousness, gradual adjustment, and eventually a kind of peace that arrived when people stopped fighting the landscape and allowed it to simply exist around them. But there was always an undercurrent of unease in this particular region. The guides in Barrow developed a habit of not discussing certain things openly. Local warnings existed in a space between acknowledged reality and tourist caution. The vehicle's radio crackled occasionally, other guides checking in. A weather update. Nothing remarkable. "How often do people actually use this area for camping?" Natalie asked from the seat behind me. She had positioned herself to look directly forward, as if the vista might reveal hidden depths if she stared at it intensely enough. "Regularly," I said. "Hunters come through in autumn. Some hunters in spring. Summer is less common. The season is short, and many people prefer established trails and designated campsites." "But people come here," she pressed. "Yes, and nothing unusual has happened to them." I glanced at her in the mirror. Nothing I would characterize as unusual. The vehicle crested a ridge, and the vast emptiness beyond seemed to hold its breath. I had made this drive before, and I had experienced that peculiar sensation that accompanied it, the feeling that the land was watching, evaluating, determining whether it would permit our passage. Most guides would never articulate this. We maintained professional detachment. We spoke of weather patterns and terrain features and wildlife management protocols, but we all felt it. Douglas photographed constantly, his camera clicking in rapid succession. Carol stared out the window without speaking. Benjamin kept his eyes closed, though I did not think he was actually sleeping. Charles gazed at the landscape with the fixed attention of someone searching for something specific. Judith Kelly simply sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing. We arrived at the campsite as the sun settled into its strange Arctic dip toward the horizon. It would not truly set. The sky would dim slightly, acquire colors that suggested twilight, then gradually brighten again. Those unaccustomed to these latitudes often found the continuous daylight unsettling. Sleep became difficult. The body's internal rhythms, calibrated over millennia to respond to darkness, rebelled against the relentless light. "We'll set up camp here," I announced, pointing to a relatively flat area near a small lake. "This spot offers fresh water and adequate protection from wind when the weather shifts." "Protection from what specifically?" Benjamin asked. It was the first substantive thing he had said since the morning. Wind, I repeated, though I heard the intonation shift in my own voice. Temperatures can drop significantly. Weather moves in quickly here. The group worked through the setup with varying degrees of competence. Natalie proved surprisingly capable, her aggressive personality translating into efficient physical effort. Douglas continued photographing, capturing images of tents being erected and people arranging supplies as if these mundane activities constituted exotic wilderness theater. Carol and Charles worked quietly together, and I noted the ease between them. They had met before, despite the booking forms suggesting otherwise. Benjamin struggled with his tent poles, his hands fumbling with connections that should have been simple. I assisted him without comment. Judith was the last to complete her setup, working methodically, wasting no movement. Night, or what passed for night at this latitude, descended as an idea rather than a fact. The sky maintained its pale quality, never achieving true darkness. This was where many of my previous groups struggled most acutely. The mind expected darkness at evening. The body expected sleep to follow the setting sun. Instead, we inhabited a landscape suspended between day and night, between expectation and reality. We gathered around the camp stove for the evening meal. I prepared a simple but substantial soup using supplies carried from Barrow. The group ate quietly, each person absorbed in private thoughts. "How long will the light last?" Judith asked, pulling her jacket tighter despite the relative warmth. "It won't truly darken for another month," I said, "but it will dim enough for sleep. The key is accepting that your body's expectations will be violated. Treat nighttime as simply a dimmer version of daytime. Adjust your sleep schedule rather than fighting it." "How do the local people manage?" Carol asked. "They adapt," I said, "or they develop insomnia, or they leave." Douglas laughed, though the sound carried an uncertain edge. "Maybe that's why they sent a cheerful group of summer adventurers to the most isolated place in North America. We're either brave or stupid." "Often the same thing," Charles said quietly. I excused myself shortly after the meal, citing the need to check equipment. This was partially true, but I also wanted to be alone with my thoughts. I walked a short distance from the camp, far enough to hear the wind moving across the tundra, but not so far as to lose sight of the tents. The landscape revealed a particular quality at this hour, a kind of watchfulness. The horizon seemed slightly closer than it should have been, as if the distant hills leaned forward with interest. The small lake beside our camp reflected an image of the sky that appeared almost identical to the sky itself, creating an unsettling sense of doubling. I had chosen this particular campsite for its water source and relatively open terrain, but I had also chosen it because it occupied territory that the local guides generally acknowledged as safer than the alternatives. There were other areas, closer to certain rock formations and wind-carved valleys, that carried darker reputations, areas where stories accumulated, where caution was expressed in indirect ways. The stories were never fully articulated. Guides spoke in references and implications. A particular valley always made the animals nervous. A specific ridge had a strange effect on compasses. A rocky outcropping was best avoided at certain times of day. Only when you pressed for specifics would someone finally mention the word that existed in every guide's vocabulary, but rarely in their formal briefings. Skinwalker. The term carried weight here, different from how it was used in the lower 48. In tourist contexts, it became a kind of macabre entertainment, a supernatural element added to wilderness narratives for dramatic effect. Up here, in Barrow and Kotzebue and the other Arctic settlements, the word existed as something else, not quite acknowledged as real, but not entirely dismissed as folklore. I had never seen anything. In 4 years of guiding expeditions through this region, I had experienced nothing that could not be explained by natural phenomena. Strange sounds could be attributed to wind patterns and ice shifts. Unusual animal behavior could be explained through territorial responses and seasonal patterns. The sensation of being watched could be explained through the psychological effects of vast landscapes on human consciousness. But I maintained the caution anyway, the way experienced guides maintained caution everywhere. The way pilots never completely dismiss mechanical oddities, the way mountaineers develop almost superstitious respect for weather patterns. These precautions were not based on concrete evidence, but on a respect for possibility, on an acknowledgement that wilderness spaces harbored aspects that human understanding incompletely grasped. I returned to camp as the sky maintained its peculiar dimness. The group had mostly retired to their tents, though Natalie remained outside, sitting on a camp chair, staring toward the distant hills. "Difficulty sleeping?" I asked. "I rarely sleep," she said, "even at home. The light here is at least honest about it. Back in civilization, you pretend the darkness means something. Here, you're just aware of wakefulness. There are sleep aids available if—" "I don't want to sleep," she interrupted. "I want to be present." I nodded and did not pursue the matter further. Morning arrived as a gradual intensification of existing light rather than a distinct transition. I woke at what my body insisted was an early hour, though the sun had never truly left the horizon. The group emerged from their tents in various states of consciousness, and I distributed a simple breakfast of bread, protein, and coffee. "How far today?" Charles asked. He seemed more present than he had during the drive, as if the wilderness had somehow clarified something for him. 40 kilometers, I said. "We'll follow the ridgeline heading northwest toward the Beaufort coast. Tomorrow we'll descend into one of the valleys for our primary camp. Today is primarily movement." "How many hours?" Benjamin asked. 8 to 10, depending on pace and terrain. We'll break at midday for a more substantial meal. The group packed their personal gear while I ensured the camp stove and excess supplies were secured. The tundra demanded respect in these practical, unglamorous ways. Leave nothing that could attract animals. Ensure that nothing could be carried off by the wind. Treat the landscape as a place that was simultaneously indifferent and intensely present. We set out in a loose line, with myself at the front and Charles positioned toward the rear to monitor the group's pace. The terrain was relatively open, scattered with low vegetation adapted to the harsh climate. In the full light of the Arctic day, the landscape acquired a kind of beauty that transcended the merely pretty. It was beauty measured in exposure and truth. Nothing was hidden. The land presented itself completely and without apology. "This is remarkable," Judith said at one point, drawing up beside me. "In my entire life, I have never seen anything quite like this." "Most people haven't," I said. "Most people spend their lives surrounded by complexity and structure. The tundra offers something different." "Emptiness," she said. "Yes, but also clarity. Things that are hidden elsewhere become apparent here." She did not respond immediately, and I sensed she was considering the meaning beneath my words. People became perceptive in these spaces, despite their inexperience. The landscape had a way of sharpening awareness. Douglas continued his photographic documentation, though the quality of his enthusiasm seemed to be shifting. After several hours of walking, even a landscape this dramatic began to settle into a kind of normalcy. The mind adapted. The extraordinary became simply the environment in which one existed. Around midday, we halted in the shelter of a slight depression that offered minimal but measurable protection from the wind. I distributed lunch, dried meat, bread, and water from our supply. The group ate quietly, each person absorbed in the physical reality of the walk, the pleasant exhaustion, the satisfaction of sustained movement, the sense of accomplishment. It was during this break that Natalie brought up the subject that I had been waiting for. "Are there predators here?" she asked. "Large ones?" "Polar bears, in some areas," I said. "This region is on the southern edge of traditional bear territory, so encounters are rare. There are wolves, though they typically avoid humans. Smaller predators exist but pose no significant threat to a group of our size." "What about things that aren't quite predators?" she pressed. "Things that aren't quite animals?" The group stilled. Everyone, I noted, became suddenly attentive, though several continued to eat as if my response were irrelevant to them. "I'm not certain what you're asking," I said, though I was quite certain. "Local guides mention things," Natalie continued, "in careful ways. In ways that suggest they're not talking about bears or wolves. In ways that suggest they're talking about something else." I took my time responding, choosing each word deliberately. Local guides understand that wilderness spaces contain elements beyond the scope of conventional biology. It's wise to maintain respect for those possibilities, but panic or preemptive fear serves no useful purpose. We maintain caution, we follow established protocols, and we move forward. That wasn't actually an answer, Benjamin observed. No, I agreed. It wasn't. We resumed walking in the early afternoon. The terrain began to shift gradually. The flat tundra gave way to rolling hills, and hills gave way to more substantial geography. We were approaching the ridgeline that would serve as our vantage point before descending into the valleys, where we would spend the next phase of the expedition. It was as we climbed one of these hills that Carol suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked. We all halted. The wind moved across the landscape, and beyond that sound was silence. Absolute silence. No birds, no distant animal movement, no sound that indicated life of any kind. "Hear what?" Douglas asked. "Exactly," Carol said. "Nothing. There are no birds here." I had not particularly noted the absence of birds until she mentioned it, but once stated, the absence became apparent. The tundra in this region supported relatively little bird life, but there were always some, distant calls, occasional flights. The silence Carol had identified was notably complete. "Low wind patterns sometimes suppress ground-nesting birds," I said. "It's a seasonal variation." But I accelerated our pace slightly, maintaining the appearance of casual adjustment while internally registering the details she had noticed. Other guides had mentioned similar observations: the absence of animal sound in certain areas, the way animals seemed to actively avoid specific territories. As late afternoon approached, we reached the ridgeline I had targeted. The vista opened before us in all directions, the vast expanse of tundra stretching toward the distant coast, the valleys unfolding beneath us like wrinkles in some ancient fabric, and beyond everything, the sense of scale that made individual human existence feel appropriately minute. "We'll camp here," I announced. "Tomorrow we descend into the valley. Tonight we're exposed, but the weather looks stable." The group set up camp with increasing competence. Practice had rendered the process almost automatic. As darkness approached, or rather, as the light shifted into its dimmer registers, we gathered around the camp stove again. I did not expect the night to be uneventful. Perhaps it was Natalie's questioning earlier, or perhaps it was simply the natural escalation of awareness that occurred as groups spent more time in isolated wilderness. But something had shifted in the group's collective consciousness. The landscape was no longer merely the landscape. It had acquired intentionality. Around what my body insisted was the late hour, Charles woke me. He was standing near my tent, silhouetted against the pale sky. "Come," he said simply. I emerged from the tent without fully waking, drawn by something in his voice. The group was gathered at the edge of our camp, all facing toward the valley below. "There," Judith pointed. At first I saw nothing. Then movement registered. A shape moving through the valley below, far too large to be any animal I could identify. It moved with a kind of liquidity that seemed to defy the anatomy of terrestrial creatures. In the strange light, its outline wavered and reformed, as if it could not decide on a consistent shape. "What is that?" Carol whispered. "A bear," I said, though I did not believe this. "Probably a polar bear, though the distance and angle make accurate identification difficult." "Bears don't move like that," Benjamin said. I did not respond because he was correct. Bears moved with a kind of solid certainty, all mass and gravity. This thing moved as if the laws governing physical bodies were suggestions it chose to largely ignore. It paused in the valley below, and for a moment I had the distinct sensation that it was observing us as intently as we were observing it. Then it moved again, accelerating suddenly, covering distance in a way that seemed to exceed the physical movement of its body. Then it vanished, not gradually, not by moving beyond our line of sight into distant darkness. It simply ceased to exist in the landscape we were surveying. The valley was empty. The space it had occupied was now merely space. "Did anyone else see that?" Douglas asked, and the question's desperate edge suggested he hoped someone would confirm shared hallucination rather than unique individual experience. "We all saw it," Natalie said. I turned to address the group, choosing words that would project calm while acknowledging what we had witnessed. That was likely a polar bear at significant distance. The angle of the light and the topography of the terrain can create optical effects. Perspective becomes difficult to judge across such open space. It was not a bear, Judith said quietly. We are all educated people. We all understand what bears are. That was not a bear. I could have argued further. I could have maintained the professional fiction that everything we had witnessed could be explained through conventional wildlife biology. Instead, I did something I had not done in previous expeditions. I told them the truth. We need to return to camp and secure all supplies, I said. We will depart at first clear light in approximately 4 hours. Pack everything now. We are no longer staying in this location. Why? Benjamin asked. If it's just a bear, because I decide the schedule of this expedition, I interrupted, and I have decided we are relocating. Now, the group moved, driven by the authority in my voice and, more importantly, by the collective recognition that something in the landscape had fundamentally altered. We packed in silence, working with efficient urgency. Within an hour, we were ready to move. Are we walking in darkness? Carol asked. We're walking in twilight, I said. It will be sufficient. I did not mention that the primary reason I wanted to move was not fear of what we had seen, but rather an understanding of what it meant. The things that moved through the tundra did not typically reveal themselves in these ways. They preferred to remain subtle, working through implication and psychological manipulation. Direct observation of that nature usually preceded much more direct confrontation. We needed distance between ourselves and this location before that confrontation could occur. We walked through the pale twilight of the Arctic night, the landscape maintaining its strange quality of being simultaneously visible and unreal. The group was silent, each person absorbed in the mechanics of navigation and forward progress. No one asked questions. No one attempted to rationalize what we had witnessed. The path led downward, descending from the ridge into the shelter of the valleys below. I had chosen our route to maximize distance from the location where we had observed the thing in the landscape. Bethel was 200 kilometers away. Kotzebue was 300. The cities felt impossibly remote, yet I was directing all our movement toward them. After 4 hours of continuous walking, exhaustion began to genuinely register. The physical stress of maintaining pace over uneven terrain, compounded by the psychological pressure of what we had experienced, pushed everyone to the edge of their capacity. We paused finally in a narrow valley, sheltered from wind and surrounded by rock formations that offered both concealment and containment. We rest here, I announced. 2 hours. Then we continue. The group collapsed more than settled. I maintained a position near the edge of our camp, ostensibly managing supplies, but actually watching the landscape for anything that suggested we were still being observed. Judith approached me silently, as if her movement had been designed to avoid detection. You are afraid, she said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. I saw no value in pretense. I am afraid, because of what we saw, and because of what it implies about the region we are traversing, and because of what it might indicate about the likelihood of future encounters. She nodded slowly. I suspected as much. In my experience, genuine danger rarely announces itself through conventional warnings. Instead, you encounter it through these moments, these sudden shifts in circumstance that make clear that your understanding of reality is incomplete. You have encountered this before, I said. This was not a question either. Different manifestations, she said. Different landscapes. But yes, I have encountered things that defy a convenient explanation. It is why I continue to travel to remote places, not despite these encounters, but because of them. At my age, most experiences are repetitions. I find encounters with genuine uncertainty to be more valuable than safety. That perspective is either admirable or evidence of psychological pathology, I said. She smiled slightly. Often the same thing. How much danger do you actually estimate we are in? I considered the question carefully. If we remain vigilant and do not deliberately provoke engagement, we may simply pass through this region unmolested. The things that inhabit these spaces are not primarily interested in humans. They prefer their existence to remain largely unobserved. We were simply in the wrong place when it chose to become briefly visible. And if we do encounter it again, then we are in significant difficulty, I said honestly. The group rested, though I noted that genuine sleep eluded most of them. They maintained the appearance of resting, eyes closed, bodies still, but their consciousness remained active, alert to any shift in the landscape or wind pattern. As the pale twilight lightened into what passed for morning, I roused everyone and we resumed our descent. The valley gradually widened, and the landscape began to acquire more conventional geography. Streams appeared, carving paths through the tundra. Vegetation became slightly more substantial. By any reasonable assessment, we were moving towards safer, more familiar territory. Yet the sense of being observed remained constant. I did not mention this to the group, but I noted that others registered it independently. Charles maintained his position at the rear, but frequently turned to examine the landscape behind us. Benjamin moved with an almost painful weariness, his head constantly turning, his body positioned as if perpetually ready to flee. Even Douglas, whose natural inclination toward casual documentation had sustained him so far, had fallen silent, his camera stored away, his presence reduced to mere forward momentum. It was during the afternoon, that strange Arctic afternoon where time became almost meaningless because the light maintained its peculiar consistency, that Carol noticed the tracks. "These," she said, pointing to marks in the soft earth beside a stream we were following. I crouched to examine them. They resembled nothing in my experience. They were roughly canine in configuration, four-toed impressions arranged in a walking pattern, but the scale was wrong. The depth indicated weight far exceeding any wolf. The spacing between tracks suggested a creature of impossible size. "What are those?" Benjamin asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Ground subsidence from permafrost conditions," I lied. "The terrain shifts constantly here. What appears to be a track might simply be erosion patterns." No one believed this. Natalie knelt beside the prints, studying them with intense focus. "These are fresh," she said, "within the last day, probably, and whatever made them was extraordinarily large." "We should not remain here," Charles said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised me. "We should move to more open terrain." I agreed, though I would not have articulated it so directly. We increased our pace significantly, the group managing the acceleration despite fatigue that must have been reaching critical levels. The valley began to open, and within another hour we emerged onto more exposed tundra. It was here that the landscape shifted in a way that was subtly but profoundly wrong. The wind pattern changed. The light acquired a quality that I could not adequately describe, and the silence, the complete absence of any sound beyond our own movement, became absolute. "It is very close," Judith said quietly. She was not asking. She was stating a fact she had somehow become aware of through mechanisms that transcended conventional sense. "We need to move faster," I said. "There is nowhere to go," Benjamin said. His voice carried the flat quality of someone experiencing the edge of breakdown. "We are in open space with no shelter and no weapon. Whatever is pursuing us can move faster than we can. There is no survival outcome here." His words hung in the air, speaking a truth that everyone had been avoiding. The tundra offered no protection, no trees to climb, no structures to shelter within, no concealment except for the shallow depressions and minor rises in terrain, none of which would provide meaningful defense against something large and determined. "Then we stand and face it," Natalie said. "That is suicide," Carol said. "Running is slower suicide," Natalie responded. "At least this offers the possibility of confrontation." I intervened, exerting what remained of my authority. "We have perhaps 2 hours until the pale twilight becomes genuinely dark, 2 hours during which we can see clearly and navigate with some precision. We will head toward the coast. Bethel has a research station approximately 50 kilometers north. If we can reach the coastal region, we have access to water and potentially supplies. We continue moving." The group accepted this not because they believed it would ensure survival, but because it offered an alternative to complete despair. We walked faster, driven by the strange urgency that exists when people understand they are being hunted. It was Douglas who first perceived the shift in the landscape that indicated the thing's position. "Behind us," he said simply, without turning around, "perhaps a kilometer, moving parallel to our path." I did not confirm or deny this. I did not need to. Everyone could sense it now. The presence in the landscape had become almost palpable, no longer something observed but something experienced, as if the air itself carried the weight of another consciousness moving through it. "Do not run," I said, aware that fear might trigger panic, and panic would lead to someone becoming separated from the group. "Maintain the pace. Continue walking." What followed was perhaps the longest hour of my life, a stretch of time compressed and extended simultaneously by the effort of maintaining forward motion while acutely aware of pursuit. The presence never became clearly visible. Occasionally, we would catch glimpses of something in our peripheral vision, a shadow that did not correspond to any physical object, a distortion in the landscape that suggested something displaced the air as it moved, but no direct observation occurred. Then, as if a switch had been activated, the presence vanished. It departed suddenly, completely, its absence as evident as its presence had been. The landscape released a kind of tension it had been holding, and the normal sounds of the tundra, wind, distant water, the subtle motion of vegetation, reasserted themselves. We continued walking, but now the urgency had transformed. We were no longer fleeing. We were simply moving, processing what had occurred, attempting to integrate an experience that fit poorly into any conventional framework of understanding. It was near what my body insisted was evening that Charles finally articulated the question that had been implicit throughout the day. "Why did it not engage us?" he asked. "If it was hunting us, if we were vulnerable, why did it not simply attack?" "Because we were still useful in a way attack would have terminated," Judith said quietly. "It was observing us, studying us, determining something through our continued existence and movement." "Determining what?" Benjamin asked. "Why it should or should not kill us," Judith said simply. We reached the research station as the light failed genuinely into something approaching night, that strange Arctic twilight compressed into its briefest span, creating 2 hours of near darkness that seemed almost surreal after days of perpetual illumination. The station consisted of 3 structures: a primary building containing research equipment and basic living quarters, a storage shed, and a small fuel depot. The primary building's door was locked, but the lock was basic, designed to keep casual visitors out rather than to provide genuine security. I forced the lock. No one commented on this breach of protocol. We entered the structure, secured the door behind us, and simply remained still for a long time. The interior was cold but functional. A generator provided basic power. Water was available from a system that drew from an underground source. Supplies occupied shelves, canned goods, emergency equipment, materials for basic survival. Someone had maintained this station for the season, though currently it was unoccupied. "We stay here tonight," I said. "Tomorrow we contact the Coast Guard and arrange extraction." No one argued. The group dispersed through the station's limited interior space, each person finding a corner to occupy, each person processing the events of the day through whatever internal mechanisms their psychology provided. I remained awake, monitoring the station's small windows, watching the landscape beyond for any indication that we were still being observed. Around what I estimated as midnight, Natalie joined me in the observation. "It will return," she said. It was not a question. "Possibly," I said. "What is your actual assessment?" I was silent for a long time. The things that inhabit these regions exist in a kind of symbiosis with the humans here. There is an understanding, unspoken but deeply embedded, about territorial boundaries. We have crossed a line by being observed directly. The conventional protocols are no longer operative. Will it follow us here? "It could," I said. "But this structure, especially with the door secured, offers some deterrent. These things prefer prey that is isolated and vulnerable. A group sheltering in a structure they cannot easily penetrate is less appealing than the exposed, running quarry we were moments ago. So it will simply wait, perhaps." She was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that seemed to sit at the core of everything. Why have you brought us here? If you knew about this danger, if you understood that this region was inhabited by these things, why did you accept the contract to guide us? Because people contract to experience wilderness, I said. Because they pay substantial money to be exposed to genuine danger, to confront the reality of nature as something vast and indifferent and dangerous. Because I provide that service, and I maintain the protocols that keep most people safe while allowing them to feel appropriately afraid. This exceeds those protocols. Yes, I agreed. It does. What happens now? Now, I said. We wait for first light, and we make the distress call that will bring rescue helicopters. We return to civilization, and we construct narratives about our experience that reduce it to manageable proportions. Bad weather, unexpected terrain, equipment failure. Nothing that cannot be explained through conventional outdoor emergency management. And the truth? She asked. The truth, I said, is that we encountered something that exists in the spaces between human understanding. Most people who have such encounters spend the remainder of their lives constructing alternative explanations. It is psychologically necessary. I did not sleep. When morning arrived, or when the light intensified to the point where it was impossible to deny day's arrival, I activated the station's communication equipment and transmitted our distress signal. A Coast Guard responded within an hour. A helicopter was dispatched from Barrow, approximately 200 kilometers away. ETA was 4 hours. The group emerged from the interior of the station with the cautious optimism that rescue induces. Hot water was available. The station's supplies yielded better food than we had consumed in days. There was an almost surreal normalcy to the experience. We were sheltering from danger in a structure designed to provide comfort while we awaited extraction. But the landscape beyond the windows remained vigilant. I observed the thing twice during that morning, and twice only because I knew exactly where to look and what to expect. It remained at significant distance, moving along the ridgelines to the south, a presence acknowledged but not directly confronting. It was, I understood, waiting to see what our next action would be, waiting to determine whether we would remain in this location or attempt further movement. The helicopter's arrival was shocking in its noise and disruption. The sky had been so silent for so long that the machine's rotor blades seemed to generate almost physical violence. It descended onto the open space south of the station, kicking up dust and debris. The group gathered their personal items, everything we had brought to this wilderness, reduced to rucksacks and weatherproof bags, and prepared for evacuation. I was last to leave the station, and I paused at the threshold, looking back toward the landscape we were abandoning. The thing was visible now, standing on the ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers distant. In the full daylight, its form was obscured by distance, but its presence was undeniable. It observed as we boarded the helicopter. It watched as the machine rose and climbed away from the research station. Only when we had achieved sufficient altitude and distance did it turn and depart, moving back toward the interior of the valleys and ridges where it presumably existed in states of being that transcended human comprehension. The helicopter delivered us to Barrows Airport, and the extraction process proceeded with the efficiency characteristic of official emergency services. The Coast Guard personnel asked questions about our circumstances, and I provided the explanation I had prepared. Unexpected weather. Terrain more challenging than anticipated. One member of the group experienced a stress response, prudent decision to abort expedition and seek shelter at the research station. None of this was technically untrue. It simply edited the complete reality into a narrative that official documentation could contain without requiring explanations that would strain credibility. The group was examined by medical personnel, a formality that confirmed we were all in reasonable physical condition despite our ordeal. No injuries, no serious dehydration, no physical evidence of trauma beyond the kind generated by forced hiking and inadequate sleep. That night we remained in Barrow. The city felt almost impossibly dense after days of isolation, though Barrow itself is hardly a large population center. Still, the presence of buildings and artificial light and other humans generated a sense of civilization's protective boundaries. I did not encounter any of the group members directly after the helicopter evacuation. Douglas and Carol departed the next morning on a flight back to the lower 48. Benjamin followed that afternoon. Charles left the day after, his ticket booked for Anchorage. Natalie remained for 2 days, and I observed her around the city's limited commercial district, always watching the landscape, particularly the areas where the horizon met sky. Judith was the last to leave. I encountered her at the airport terminal the morning of her departure. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Resume guiding other expeditions," I said. "Continue my work. Will you tell them?" "Tell them what?" "The truth." I considered the question. "No," I said. "The protocols demand discretion. If guides routinely reported encounters with these things, the entire industry would collapse. Tourism would cease. The wilderness would become off-limits due to official liability concerns. It is better if people believe the danger is manageable, predictable, something that can be addressed through conventional risk mitigation. Even though people will die based on that incomplete information? People die everywhere, I said. The wilderness simply offers them the opportunity to die with genuine awareness of their vulnerability. Most people live their entire lives never truly comprehending how precarious their existence is. The Arctic teaches this lesson more efficiently than most places. "That is a rationalization," Judith said. "Yes," I agreed, "but it is the rationalization I have constructed to justify my continued work." She nodded, accepting this without suggesting she agreed with it. "I have traveled extensively," she said. "I have encountered many things that defy conventional explanation. What we experienced in that wilderness was not unique, different in specifics, but not in fundamentals. There is a layer of reality that most humans remain unaware of. Occasionally, the boundary becomes permeable. Occasionally, we glimpse what exists on the other side." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you should understand that what we experienced was an honor," she said. "Most people spend their entire lives seeking authenticity, seeking genuine encounter with reality as it actually exists. We achieved that, if only briefly. We should not regret it simply because it was frightening." I did not know how to respond to this perspective. She boarded her flight shortly after, and I watched as the aircraft climbed away from Barrows Airport, carrying her back toward the lower 48 and toward whatever other encounters awaited her. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my work. I accepted new contracts. I guided new groups through the Arctic wilderness, maintaining the same protocols, providing the same carefully calibrated experience. No group encountered what the previous one had encountered. The landscape seemed, in those subsequent expeditions, to maintain its conventional boundaries. But I knew this peace was temporary. I knew that the thing we had encountered in the valleys and ridges of that region was patient. It existed in a state that transcended immediate urgency. It would encounter humans again, perhaps through my continued work, perhaps through other guides or other circumstances. I developed a hypothesis during those subsequent months. The things that inhabit these regions function as a kind of test. They evaluate humans through direct contact. Most of us fail this test. We flee. We panic. We construct narratives that refuse the truth of what we experienced. But occasionally, someone like Judith manages to witness without completely fracturing their understanding of reality. And perhaps that is what these things are seeking. Not prey, necessarily, but evidence that human consciousness can expand sufficiently to comprehend their existence. The group I guided into that Arctic wilderness scattered across the continental United States. I never heard from most of them again. Douglas and Carol returned to their normal lives, presumably processing their experience through the lenses of their respective psychologies. Benjamin. I encountered news of him 2 years later through an online obituary. A car accident in the Midwest. Nothing that suggested any connection to what we experienced in Alaska. Charles, I learned, had moved to Montana and purchased land in an isolated region. He maintains regular communication with the Barrow guides, I was told, occasionally contracting for expeditions into areas that other clients avoid. Whether he seeks another encounter with the thing we fled, or whether he simply cannot return to his previous life and its comfortable denial, I do not know. Natalie disappeared from any accessible public record. No social media presence, no professional licensing renewal, no indication that she continued to exist in any documented capacity. Whether this represents a deliberate withdrawal from civilization or something more concerning, I cannot determine. Judith sent me a single postcard, 18 months after our expedition. It bore no message, only an address in a rural area of Colorado. I never visited that address, but I maintain the postcard, and I sometimes wonder what Judith found in those subsequent years, what other realities she encountered, what other boundaries she crossed. As for myself, I continue to guide expeditions through the Arctic wilderness. I continue to maintain the protocols that keep most people safe while allowing them to feel appropriately afraid. I continue to work in the spaces between human understanding and the vast indifference of natural forces. And occasionally, on expeditions to certain valleys and ridges, I catch glimpses of a presence that moves with impossible fluidity, that observes with patient intelligence, that maintains the boundaries between its realm and ours with what I can only interpret as deliberate restraint. I have never been certain whether this presence is grateful that I continue to deliver humans to it for evaluation, or whether it simply accepts my role in this strange transaction as inevitable and unavoidable. I suspect, in the end, that to creatures like these, gratitude and resentment are equally irrelevant. They exist in states of being that transcend human emotional frameworks. They simply continue their existence, persistent and patient, evaluating each human who crosses into their territory, determining whether consciousness itself might be capable of genuine expansion. Some pass the test, most do not. And I, caught between two realities, the one of official explanation and the one of authentic experience, continue my work, guiding people into danger while maintaining the careful illusion of safety. This is the only honest conclusion I can offer. The wilderness you think you know is not the wilderness that exists. Beneath the comfortable narratives, the predictable dangers, the manageable risks, lies a layer of reality that your conventional understanding refuses to acknowledge. You can spend your entire life avoiding this recognition, or you can step into that Arctic landscape, into those valleys and ridges where the horizon bends wrong and the silence becomes absolute, and there discover whether your consciousness is resilient enough to comprehend what moves through those spaces. Most people are not, but some are, and the things that inhabit those boundaries are endlessly patient, waiting to encounter you. The weight of preparation had been heavy on my shoulders for weeks before we departed. 6 of us had committed to this expedition into Alaska's remote interior, and I found myself as the de facto leader, though leadership in such situations felt more like responsibility for potential catastrophe than anything resembling authority. We arrived in Bethel on a Tuesday evening, when the summer light refused to surrender to darkness. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of amber and copper. The small airport felt smaller than I expected, and stepping onto the tarmac, I could taste the cold bite of northern air, despite the calendar insisting it was July. Natalie Ramirez was the first to join me at the rental office. She had this habit of moving with deliberate purpose, each step calculated. At 35, she possessed the lean build of someone accustomed to physical exertion, though her eyes held something I couldn't quite place. Something that suggested she knew more than she was saying about why she wanted this expedition. The locals seemed strange when I asked about supplies, she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. At the general store, the way they looked at us. Not hostile exactly, more like warning. I dismissed it as the natural weariness of small communities toward outsiders. That was before I understood what lived in those forests. Douglas James arrived with the camping equipment, his truck laden with tents, portable stoves, and navigation gear. At 54, he moved like a man accustomed to wilderness. His weathered face suggested decades spent under open skies, and his hands bore the calluses of genuine labor. But there was something else about Douglas, a tension that seemed to increase the moment the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "We need to be back in town before full dark," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a requirement. "Every night, no exceptions. I don't care what the plan says." Carol Watson joined us that evening, her presence commanding despite her relatively quiet demeanor. She was 50, with the bearing of someone who had spent her life making decisions that affected others. She'd organized this expedition with meticulous attention to detail, and I'd assumed that meant she knew exactly what we were doing. I was wrong. There's a hunting cabin about 20 kilometers northeast, Carol explained, spreading a map across the table in our motel room. Belongs to a former client of mine. It's equipped, relatively secure, and it provides a good base for exploring the region. Benjamin Brooks, our group's youngest member at 42, studied the map with the intensity of a man who believed he could read stories and topography. He had described himself as a nature documentarian, which I interpreted as someone who took excellent photographs and had convinced people to pay for his travels. But his knowledge of animal behavior proved invaluable, and his camera equipment was genuinely impressive. What's this area? Benjamin pointed to a section of the map marked with hand-drawn circles and what appeared to be warning symbols in faded pencil. No one answered immediately. Judith Kelly, the oldest among us at 68, had been the first to book this expedition. She'd paid the deposit before most of us had even committed to dates. She claimed she was a nature enthusiast conducting personal research, but I'd discovered through subtle questioning that she was actually writing about indigenous folklore and the way such stories persisted in remote communities. Old maps, Judith said finally, studying the marks, from when trappers and hunters tried to catalog the region, before most record-keeping became formalized. But that wasn't quite the truth either, as I would later understand. Charles Sanders completed our party. At 57, he was an enigma, wrapped in the affectation of a wealthy businessman who decided to reconnect with nature. He spent significant money on equipment and casually mentioned properties he owned in various states. Yet he treated the wilderness with the reverence of someone who genuinely feared it. That first night in Bethel, we gathered in the motel's small dining area. The local cook, a woman who introduced herself as Margaret, prepared salmon with surprising skill. But when I mentioned our plans to explore the region, her hands stilled for just a moment. "You should hire a guide," she said. "Someone who knows the land and knows what to avoid." "We have navigation equipment," I replied, "and we're experienced." Margaret said nothing more, but as she cleared our plates, I caught her exchanging a glance with Douglas, a look that suggested communication had occurred between them before we even arrived. That night I couldn't sleep. The midnight sun cast my motel room in perpetual twilight, and my mind circled endlessly around small details that seemed wrong without my ability to articulate exactly why. The warning in Margaret's voice, the tension in Douglas's jaw, the marks on Judith's map that looked almost like fence posts or boundaries drawn by someone desperate to define dangerous territory. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Douglas in the hallway outside my room. His voice was low, urgent, speaking into his phone. "They don't understand. These people have never dealt with it. One summer night, they think they know what nightfall means in the north. They have no fucking idea." The line went dead. I lay in the darkness, watching the amber light at the edges of the curtains, and felt the first genuine stirring of dread. We departed for the cabin at dawn. The drive was beautiful in a way that seemed almost mocking. Towering evergreens, rushing water that reflected the sky like liquid silver, wildlife that scattered at our approach. Carol drove while I sat passenger, watching the landscape transform from managed settlements to genuine wilderness. "Have you ever heard of skinwalkers?" Carol asked suddenly, her eyes fixed on the road. "Native American folklore," I said. "Navajo, primarily. Beings that can take animal forms, consumed with malevolence." "That's the simplified version," Carol said. "The version that gets published in books and shared around campfires by people who don't actually know anything. The reality is far more complicated and far more dangerous." "Why are you telling me this?" Carol's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "Because I've been to the interior of Alaska before, to places most people avoid, and I've learned that stories, real stories, the kind that indigenous peoples have refined over thousands of years, exist for reasons, usually because something in those stories is true." The cabin emerged from the forest like a structure that had decided to exist only partially in our reality. It was well maintained, equipped with propane heating and a large water tank, and positioned on a ridge that allowed views across miles of forest in every direction. Carol had not exaggerated its security. The doors were reinforced, the windows had substantial locks, and the interior had been designed with survival as the primary concern. "Who owned this place?" Benjamin asked, walking the perimeter with his camera. "A man named Harlan Cross," Carol said. "He spent 40 years studying animal migration patterns and the relationship between predator populations and human settlements. He died 5 years ago, left the cabin to a preservation society, but it's rarely used." "Why did he die?" Judith asked. Carol was quiet for a long moment. "He went outside during the night," she said finally. "During the season when the sun barely sets. He told his daughter he needed to observe something. The next morning, they found his body a kilometer from the cabin. The official report said he was attacked by bears, but the wounds, they weren't consistent with any known animal." That evening, as the sun continued its shallow arc across the horizon, we sat on the cabin's porch and watched the forest. The birds had gone quiet. The normal sounds of wilderness, wind through branches, distant water, the subtle movements of life, had faded to an almost complete absence. "We should establish a watch rotation," Douglas said. "2 people awake at all times after midnight, someone monitoring the perimeter." "This is supposed to be a relaxation trip," Charles complained, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is a trip into a region where things live that most people in the world have never encountered," Douglas countered. "Things that don't follow normal rules. Humor me." I assigned myself the first watch, along with Natalie. The others dispersed to prepare bedding and supplies. As darkness crept across the sky with impossible slowness, Natalie and I sat with our backs to the cabin wall, facing the tree line. "I know things," Natalie said quietly. "Things that I haven't told the others. Things I've only told Carol." "What kind of things?" "My brother disappeared in this region 8 years ago. He was hunting. He was supposed to be back by evening. They found his camp 3 days later, completely intact. No signs of struggle. Just an empty tent and equipment left behind, as if he'd simply stepped into the trees and stopped existing." My stomach tightened. "Did they search for him?" "For weeks. Brought in trackers, search teams, everything. It was like he'd been erased from the landscape. And the locals, the Yupik people who live here, they weren't surprised. They told my family that he'd done something, made some kind of mistake. They wouldn't specify what." "Do you think he was killed by an animal? A bear? A predator of some kind?" Natalie turned to look at me. In the amber twilight, her eyes seemed impossibly old. "I think something decided to wear his skin, and when it was finished, there was nothing left of him to find." Around 4 in the morning, when the night had become its palest, we heard the howl. It wasn't the sound any of us expected. It possessed a quality that seemed wrong. Not quite wolf, not quite canine in any conventional sense. It contained harmonics that shouldn't exist in animal vocalizations, a complexity that suggested something mimicking the shape of a wolf's voice, while adding dimensions that belonged to something entirely other. Douglas appeared immediately at the cabin door, rifle in hand. "Inside," he commanded. "Now, lock everything. Window shutters closed." We didn't argue. The sound had generated a response in our nervous systems that bypassed rational thought, pure dread, pure animal understanding that something was fundamentally wrong. Inside, with the shutters fastened and every door secured, we gathered in the central room. The rifle in Douglas's hand seemed impossibly small against the weight of the darkness pressing against the cabin's walls. "What was that?" Charles whispered. "Something that wants us to know it's aware of us," Judith said. She was calm, almost meditative. "Something that's decided to announce itself." "Why would it do that?" I asked. "Because," Judith said, "we entered its territory, and it wants us to understand exactly what the rules are." The sound came again as dawn finally broke with genuine darkness lifting from the land. This time it was closer, echoing from what seemed to be the forest directly east of the cabin. Douglas stood at the window, a pair of binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the tree line with the intensity of a man looking for something he desperately hoped not to find. "It's still there," he said quietly, 300 meters out, moving along the ridge. "What is it?" Benjamin demanded, his camera forgotten, his usual enthusiasm completely absent. "Describe it." "I can't," Douglas said. Because what I'm seeing doesn't align with anything in my experience. The body structure is wrong. The way it moves is wrong. It looks like a wolf, except the proportions are all distorted. Too tall, too angular. Natalie had positioned herself as far from the window as possible, pressed into a corner of the main room. Carol stood near the kitchen area, methodically checking supplies and making notes on a pad of paper. She moved like someone executing a plan she'd mentally rehearsed many times. "We need to stay inside," Carol said, "all day, regardless of how bright it gets. Skinwalkers are more vulnerable during full daylight, but they don't stop existing. They simply operate under constraints. They have limitations we need to understand." "Skinwalker," Charles repeated, the word foreign in his mouth. "You're actually suggesting that thing outside is a skinwalker, that we're dealing with folklore made manifest." "Folklore," Judith said, "is usually just poorly understood documentation of reality. People observed these things for thousands of years. They developed specific protocols for dealing with them. Those protocols exist in the surviving stories." "What protocols?" I asked. "Don't leave the group," Judith began, counting on her fingers. "Don't acknowledge it directly. Looking it in the eyes is dangerous. Don't attempt to convince it of anything. They don't operate on human logic. Most importantly, don't shed your own skin, metaphorically or literally. They're drawn to spiritual vulnerability and physical wounds." "That's insane," Charles said flatly. "It's also all we have," Carol replied. The day stretched on with agonizing slowness. The cabin felt increasingly like a trap, four walls that provided the illusion of security, while something utterly incomprehensible circled the perimeter. Benjamin attempted to photograph it several times, moving to different windows and adjusting his zoom lens, but each time he tried to capture an image, the thing seemed to sense his attention and withdrew into the deeper forest. Around what we were calling afternoon, though the sun made traditional time almost meaningless, Douglas noticed something that shifted our understanding of the situation. There were now two of them. "The second one came from the north," he reported, his voice carrying a vibration of barely controlled fear. "It's larger than the first. The movements are more deliberate." "There could be a pack," Benjamin said, "a family unit. They hunt together." "These things don't hunt like normal predators," Carol said. "They hunt according to logic we don't have a framework for understanding. They may be hunting us. They may be studying us. They may be doing something else entirely that we lack the cognitive capacity to recognize." Judith had begun writing furiously in a journal she'd brought, documenting everything. The times Douglas reported seeing them, their positions, their movements. She wrote with the dedication of someone compiling evidence for posterity, or perhaps for someone coming after us who might need this information to survive. "My brother's journal was found with his tent," Natalie said suddenly. She'd been silent for hours, and her voice came out hoarse from disuse. "I never mentioned this. My family kept it quiet. In the final entry, he wrote that he could see it watching him from the tree line. He described its eyes as containing an intelligence that felt contemptuous. He wrote that it was waiting for something, that it was evaluating the texture of my fear." "How did he conclude?" Carol asked gently. "He wrote, 'I'm going to go outside now. I don't think it wants me to stay inside. I think the tent feels like an insult to it.'" The implication hung in the air between us like poison gas. Evening approached with the slow, deliberate pace of something alive and waiting. The light took on a quality that seemed almost malevolent. Not quite twilight, not quite noon, but something that existed in the spectrum between. Douglas kept the rifle loaded and positioned near the main door. I noticed he'd chambered a round, though I doubted anyone had actually discussed whether shooting one of these things was even possible. It was Charles who heard the scratching first. It came from the roof, a deliberate, methodical sound like something with claws attempting to find purchase on the metal panels. But more disturbing than the sound itself was its deliberateness. It wasn't the random scratching of an animal looking for entry. It was calculated, probing, testing. "It's trying to find a way in," Benjamin whispered. "No," Judith said. "It's trying to get us to think about leaving. It's creating pressure, psychological stress. It wants us to panic and make mistakes." The scratching continued for nearly an hour. When it finally stopped, The silence that followed seemed worse than the sound had been. We sat in that silence, listening to our own breathing, trying to convince ourselves that what we'd experienced had been real. Around what we calculated to be midnight, Natalie's nose began to bleed. It happened without warning, blood dripping steadily onto her shirt, despite her tilting her head back and pinching the bridge of her nose. But as I watched, I realized it wasn't coming from her nostrils. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside her, as if her entire sinus cavity was hemorrhaging. "This is a sign," Judith said, moving quickly to help her. "This means it's becoming aware of her specifically. It means it's recognizing her connection to what happened to her brother." "We need to stop this," I said, looking toward Douglas and the rifle. "Whatever that thing is, we need to kill it." "With a rifle?" Carol's laugh was short, bitter. "You can't shoot something that doesn't exist fully in our reality. You can't kill something that doesn't play by our rules. The bullet would pass through it like it's made of smoke." "Then what do we do?" Charles demanded, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine panic. "We endure," Carol said. "Until daylight. We maintain the barricades, and we endure." But endurance became increasingly difficult as the night progressed. Benjamin began to hear voices. Not auditory hallucinations, he insisted, but actual voices coming from just outside the cabin, mimicking our own conversations. He heard his mother calling him by a childhood nickname only she had ever used. He heard himself speaking, recounting memories that he'd never shared with anyone. "It's not hearing," Judith explained. "It's mimicking, taking the shape of voices, using sound the way it uses physical form, as a tool for manipulation and infiltration of our psychological space." Charles stopped sleeping. He sat rigid in a chair, staring at nothing, his eyes occasionally twitching toward windows we'd sealed shut. Douglas gave him water, which he drank mechanically, but he never spoke, never made eye contact. It was as if a significant portion of his consciousness had been cordoned off by whatever was outside. I found myself unable to stop thinking about the cabin's previous owner, Harlan Cross. He'd spent 40 years studying predator-prey dynamics, understanding the relationship between hunters and hunted, and then one night he'd gone outside. Had he gone willingly? Or had something made him understand? The way that Judith's description suggested these things could make humans comprehend things outside normal comprehension, that leaving was necessary, that the act of stepping outside was somehow a survival mechanism. Around 4 in the morning, I heard Douglas in the kitchen, speaking quietly into his satellite phone. "I told you I shouldn't come here," he said. "I told you what I learned the last time. These things have memory. They recognize individual humans. I killed one of them in 09. This one outside, it knows me. It's been waiting. It's not here for the others. It's here because I came back." There was a pause. "No, you can't send help. What would help even look like? You can't send the military to fight folklore. You can't shoot an idea. You can't kill something that exists in the spaces between what's real and what's imagined." Another pause. "I'm not leaving them to die. I'm going to find a way to finish this." He disconnected and noticed me standing in the doorway. "What did you do in 2009? I asked. "I went hunting," Douglas said. "Real hunting. Moose, primarily, in this region. A skinwalker appeared near my camp. It took the form of a cow moose, but something about it was fundamentally wrong. I shot it 7 times before it finally stopped moving. I thought I'd killed it. I spent 3 years afterward checking if it was actually dead. And it came back. Different form, but the same intelligence behind the eyes, same contempt. I recognized it because skinwalkers carry traces of their previous forms somehow, scars that transfer between shapes. This one outside, it's the same one. It's been hunting me since I put those bullets in it. So it's not interested in us, just you. It's interested in whoever is here with me," Douglas said. "That's how they work. They take whatever is present and they use it as leverage. They're interested in maximum suffering. They're interested in turning alliances into betrayals, love into trauma." Morning finally came. Not suddenly, but as a gradual lightening of the sky that felt like waking from a nightmare and discovering the nightmare was now your waking life. The full daylight pushed the creatures back, but they didn't disappear. Douglas continued to track them with his binoculars. "They're moving away," he reported, heading deeper into the forest. "But they're not gone. They're just retreating to cover. We have maybe 8 hours before sunset. We need to use that time to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Charles asked. He'd been silent for so long that hearing his voice was startling. "For the night to come again," Carol said. "For however many nights it takes before we can leave this place." On the second full day at the cabin, we attempted the impossible. We decided to leave. The logic, as Carol explained it, was sound on a rational level. The Skinwalkers were more vulnerable in daylight, their powers limited, their forms less flexible. If we moved quickly, traveled in the open where they would be forced to operate under constraints, we could reach the nearest settlement, a small community about 40 kilometers south, before darkness arrived again. Douglas argued against it with the vehemence of someone who'd survived something most people wouldn't have survived. "Every time you move, you change the dynamic," he said. "These things are hunters. They understand territory. The moment we're in motion, we're vulnerable in ways that being stationary doesn't allow for." But Charles was losing his mind. His silence had evolved into something worse, a kind of catatonic state interrupted by moments of sudden violence. He'd attempted to open the cabin door at 3 in the morning, completely unresponsive to our attempts to restrain him. Benjamin had tackled him, and they'd struggled across the floor while the rest of us watched, uncertain whether to help or leave Charles to whatever compulsion was driving him. Judith believed Charles was being directly influenced. "It's chosen him as a conduit," she said quietly. "It's found something in his psychology, some vulnerability, and it's using him as a direct connection." "Then we absolutely have to leave," Carol insisted. "If one of us is compromised, we need to get to safety before that compromise becomes catastrophic." Douglas finally acquiesced with obvious reluctance. He spent most of the morning preparing our exit, checking maps, calculating distances, gathering supplies that would sustain us during the drive. Benjamin's photographs of the Skinwalkers had come out perfectly clear, impossibly detailed, as if the creatures had wanted to be documented. Judith continued her notes with the diligence of someone writing a final testimony. We left at noon, the sun at its highest point, the sky so bright that shadows barely existed. Douglas drove while I sat passenger, constantly turning to watch the forest behind us. Natalie, Judith, and Benjamin occupied the middle row, with Charles in the back, sedated with medication from the cabin's first aid kit that we hoped would keep him unconscious long enough for us to reach safety. The road was barely a road, more of a collection of drive-worn paths that the truck navigated with difficulty. For the first 2 hours, I dared to believe we might actually escape. The forest passed beside us without incident. The sky remained brilliant and clear. Behind us, there was no sign of pursuit. It was Benjamin who noticed the elk first. It stood on the road ahead, massive and impossibly still. Douglas immediately began to slow the truck, but Benjamin made a noise of warning, something between a gasp and a shout. "That's not an elk," he said. "Look at the legs. The proportions are wrong." The creature's form was indeed wrong in ways that were almost impossible to articulate. It had the basic structure of an elk, complete with an impressive rack of antlers, but everything was subtly distorted. The legs were too long, the body too angular. The way it stood suggested muscles and joints that didn't align with anything in natural biology. "Don't stop," Douglas said, accelerating. "Don't engage it. Don't even look directly at it." But as we approached, the creature turned its massive head to watch us, and in its eyes, massive, black, utterly empty of anything resembling animal consciousness, was an intelligence so profound and so deeply hostile that I felt my entire body contract with primal terror. The moment we passed it, the thing moved, not gracefully, not naturally, but with a mechanical purpose that suggested it was operating according to principles we couldn't perceive. It bounded toward the truck with an ungainly gait that somehow covered impossible distances, and I heard its antlers scrape across the truck's roof with a sound like knives on metal. Douglas accelerated harder, and the truck lurched forward. In the side mirror, I watched the thing continue its pursuit, but it began to fade, to become less substantial, as if the concentrated daylight was somehow causing it to lose cohesion. "It's burning in the sunlight," Judith said from the back seat. "The daylight is actually harming it. That's why they hunt at night, but it was desperate. It risked exposure because it didn't want us to leave." We drove for another 2 hours without incident, and the sun began its final descent. The horizon took on shades of amber and gold, and I felt a growing dread that the entire endeavor had been fundamentally miscalculated. "How far to the settlement?" I asked. 20 kilometers, Douglas said. "We won't make it before dark." The forest was becoming more difficult to navigate as the light decreased. The path, never clearly defined, seemed to become even more uncertain. Douglas slowed the truck, peering intently through the windshield as twilight gathered around us. Then the truck stopped, not because Douglas had braked, but because we'd hit something. Not a rock, not a fallen tree, but something that had deliberately placed itself in our path. There were 3 of them now. Not the ones that had stalked the cabin, but different forms, shapes that seemed to combine elements of various animals into configurations that nature had never intended. One bore the basic structure of a deer but with the forelegs of a human, ending in hands rather than hooves. Another was almost wolf-shaped but with a head that contained too many angles, as if it had been folded in dimensions our eyes couldn't quite track. The third was perhaps the most unsettling, roughly humanoid but wrong in every conceivable way, with proportions that seemed to shift slightly every time my focus settled on it. "Get out of the truck," Natalie whispered suddenly. We all turned to stare at her. "I'm serious," she said. "Get out, all of us, except Charles. Leave him inside." "Absolutely not," Carol said immediately. "You don't understand what they want," Natalie continued, and her voice had taken on a quality of absolute certainty. "They've been trying to tell us since we arrived. They're not interested in all of us. They're interested in me, in my participation. I need to stop running and acknowledge it." Judith put a hand on Natalie's arm. "What do you mean, acknowledge it?" "My brother made a contract," Natalie said. "When he went outside, I think he did it to protect me, to give me a gift, to transfer something to me that the Skinwalkers desired. And by running, by refusing to accept that gift, I'm violating the terms. They're going to kill all of us if I don't." "No," Benjamin said. "I'm not leaving anyone." "You don't have a choice," Natalie said. "None of you do. Douglas, you drove. Open the door." Something in her voice, a command that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind, made Douglas reach for the door handle. He moved mechanically, his face a mask of conflict, but his hands obeyed. "Natalie," I began. She turned to me with eyes that were no longer quite her own. They held the same contempt, the same absolute absence of human empathy that I'd seen in the creatures surrounding us. "Thank you for being kind to my body," she said. And then she smiled, and I realized that nothing I'd thought was Natalie, nothing I'd believed was a human woman grieving her brother, had ever actually been human at all. She stepped out of the truck, and the creatures moved to receive her. As we watched in frozen horror, her form began to shift. Her skin took on qualities of leather and fur, her joints bent in directions that joints should not bend. But through it all, there was a sense of homecoming, as if she were finally expressing something that she'd been forced to contain in a human shape. The thing that had been wearing Natalie's body moved away from the truck with an easy grace, and the other creatures followed, disappearing into the forest as the last light of day drained from the sky. Douglas immediately accelerated, the truck lurching forward as he pressed the pedal to the floor. We drove with the headlights on full brightness, and Charles screamed from the back seat, not in fear but in some kind of ecstatic agony, as if the drug was wearing off and he was becoming aware of what was happening to his consciousness. We reached the settlement at full darkness, nearly midnight. Kotzebue's lights seemed impossibly bright, impossibly real after what we'd experienced. Douglas drove straight to the police station, and we stumbled out of the truck like refugees fleeing a war zone. The local authorities took our statement with increasing skepticism. 6 people arrived in a truck with 1 person missing, and our story involved creatures that shouldn't exist, psychological manipulation, and a woman who'd revealed herself to be something other than human. The official report, when we finally saw it days later, attributed our experience to acute stress syndrome and mass hallucination brought on by isolation and the unusual light conditions of the midnight sun. But Judith knew the truth. She documented it all in her journal, and in the weeks that followed, she worked on compiling her findings into something resembling a coherent account. What she eventually told us, what she admitted, more precisely, was that Natalie had been a skinwalker from the very beginning. Her brother probably was too, Judith explained in the hotel room where we'd been given shelter. They likely operate in family groups. The ritual of his disappearance, the way he went outside, that was probably the moment when he fully transitioned, when he stopped pretending to be human. But she lived a normal life, Carol said. A job, a family, a history, a cover, Judith said. Just as the forms they take are covers. The human skin is just another shape they wear, and she wore it for years, gathering intelligence, learning our patterns, our vulnerabilities. She was perfect for this expedition. She knew what her brother had discovered, what he'd become. She was waiting for the right moment to claim what she'd inherited. Charles never fully recovered. He was admitted to a psychiatric facility in Seattle, where he spent his remaining years, 2 years as it turned out, in a state of quiet dissociation, occasionally referring to the time the sky stopped being a boundary and when I understood that everything I'd always thought was a lie. Benjamin burned his photographs, all of them. He claimed they were worthless, that the digital files had been corrupted, that he'd destroyed the negatives. But I suspect the truth was more complicated. I suspect he'd looked at those images closely enough to see what was really there, not a creature mimicking an elk or a wolf, but something that existed partially outside conventional perception, and that, perceiving it too clearly, had damaged something in his ability to process reality. Douglas left Alaska within a month of our return. He sold his equipment, terminated his contracts, and disappeared into a region of Montana that makes Bethel look like Times Square by comparison. Before he left, he told me something that I've spent years trying to understand. They were never hunting us, he said. That's what I finally realized. They were recruiting. Natalie went inside that truck, knowing what she was, and while she wore that form, while she walked among us as something almost human, she was changing us. We're all infected now, not biologically, but spiritually, psychologically. We carry the marks of her presence. Is that why you're leaving? I asked. It's why I can't stay near anyone, he replied. I never found Natalie Ramirez. Her apartment in Anchorage had been cleaned out the day we arrived back. Her job had been notified of her resignation through email. Her family, the family she'd claimed to have, didn't exist in any verifiable way. She was a phantom that had briefly solidified around us, and then dispersed back into the spaces between things. Judith finished her book. It was published under a pseudonym by a press that specializes in folklore and indigenous studies. I've read it. It's the most thorough documentation I have of what actually happened in that cabin, in that forest, under the midnight sun of Alaska's most remote interior. But the book ends with a question that Judith was unable or unwilling to answer. If Natalie was always a skinwalker, always something inhuman wearing a human form, then what does that make the rest of us? What did we become the moment we allowed her to travel with us, to share our space, to integrate herself into our group? I still think about that question every time the sun begins to set, every time darkness gathers, every time I catch my reflection in a window and notice something slightly wrong about the proportions of my face. Because I'm not entirely certain I'm still myself. And I'm not sure I'd recognize it if I'd stopped being human somewhere in those forests near Bethel, somewhere in that cabin surrounded by creatures that wear shapes like skin, somewhere in that impossible Alaskan night that refused to acknowledge the boundary between day and darkness,